Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Traitor's face in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 11, Into the Ashland. In some places, fire could be a very difficult thing to find. Zuko took another breath, focusing on the air's passage through his nostrils and down into the lungs where it became fuel for his chi. He could feel the chi within his body, the network of energy that stretched throughout his fibers and touched the edge of spirit. It was stronger now than it had been in years, thanks to his body's restoration over the last month. He actually felt alive once more, yet the flame within still refused to answer his call, no matter how loudly he called, no matter how long he meditated. The absence within tried to push him away, but he would not back down against a mere absence. There were much greater things to fear, like, "Pack your bags, Zuzu. Mai has finally come through." Zuko startled from his cross-legged lotus position, nearly disrupting the short table in front of him and the candles arrayed across its surface. The tongues of flame danced at the wind of his movement, their light splaying chaotically across the walls of his oversized room. It was the first time they had moved since he began his meditation. Teeth reflexively grinding together at that thought, Zuko turned to regard his sister with his good eye. "I told you to knock before coming in here." "Oh, I'm so sorry." Her tone was anything but contrite, and she didn't even try to hide that she was rolling her eyes. "I merely thought that you would be interested in news of the one woman in the world with the poor taste to expend effort on your behalf. Mai has determined the location where you can at last restore your honor." Zuko waited expectantly, but Azula simply leaned against his bedroom's door frame and stared back at him. His patience ran out before hers. "Where?" "I'm so glad you asked." Her message was short, little more than the proper codes and headers to get it to me, but the content was quite informative. "Crescent Island. I don't suppose you know where that is." This time, it was Zuko who refused to speak. Azula favored him with a smile before continuing, "It's the last outer island shown on most maps, and I took the liberty of requesting some additional information while I was at the outpost. The fire sages used to keep a temple there, but they sold the land to the military when the Grand Sage needed to make those reparation payments to Uncle. If the name has any ring of familiarity to you, it's for the waterbender prison that was built there. I presume the Avatar is looking for a teacher, and considers breaking one out of the most secure prison on the planet to be preferable to infiltrating the Dragon of the North's territory." Zuko ignored Azula's attempt to flaunt her information sources and focused on one core fact. "That island is part of the homeland. I'd have to break my banishment to ambush the Avatar there." "Ah, so you can think." Azula gave a nod that was almost approving. "Yes, that's an awkward point, but I've already communicated the problem to Father. Between his influence and outright bribery, I'm sure we can shape the story so that the Fire Lord will accept it. After all, it's just a spot of dirt in the ocean boasting nothing but a prison for foreigners, far from the rest of the homeland, so perhaps some creative reclassification can be done." Zuko wasn't so sure, but even if it was true, he'd be putting more trust and dependence on Azula. And Father? He wondered if having the flame within back would make him feel warmer. "What's our timing for the ambush?" Mai was less than helpful in that regard, so our only choice is to hurry to the island and then wait around for as long as it takes. I've already arranged for a ship to take us there, and June shall convey us to the port on her Shirshu. It's better to keep our travel accommodations unofficial, for now." Azula straightened, and gave one last parting nod. "We leave at dawn." Zuko remembered his first ride on the Shirshu as being both painful and unpleasant, back when Azula had first found him and was bringing him to be cleaned up. Now, it was no longer a painful experience, but not the least bit more pleasant. The company was only part of the problem. June was at the front of the saddle, with Azula behind her, and Zuko at the rear. The mole-like beast loped quickly across the landscape, cutting a path through the colonies. Zuko watched them pass by, finding a kind of unreality in the sights. He knew the colonies well, had slept in the gutters of little towns and massive cities both, had clawed through the waste of the people of fire and earth in search of something to eat, had been pushed around by bullies in armor and bullies in farming rags. He knew the smells, the textures, the windings paths of the colonies, and still experienced them in his dreams. To see them passing so quickly, distant images on the horizon that might as well have been mirages, made the dreams seem more alive than the waking world. It was a silent trip until they stopped for the first night. While the group had dinner around the campfire, Angela gave a monologue about the path she wanted to take to the port, complete with dramatic motions towards her map. Afterward, June spent the whole evening having a conversation in baby talk with her Shirshu. Zuko kept silent, and endured Angela's regular barbs. They set off again early the next day, but things did not go as smoothly as they had the prior day. The ground grew rockier, like a mountain had died and its bones were left to sink slowly into the ground. Sharp gray cliffs rose up out of nowhere to twist the roads, and there seemed to be a thickness to the air. Zuko didn't understand until mid-morning, when June brought her mount to a halt, and pointed ahead. "This is bad. That's an ashland." He had heard the term, but never seen one. Zuko sat taller in the saddle, and sure enough, he could see a brown smudge on the horizon. Between the bounty hunter and Zuko, Angela squirmed to try to get a better look over the shoulder of their guide. What?" June snorted. "They're relatively new. When the Fire Nation made that big comet offensive, a lot of landscape got scorched. Some of it was so bad, the only thing left were dunes of ash. The Earth Kingdom the colonial continent got a lot more little deserts, that day." Zuko's vision was suddenly eclipsed by Angela's top knot as she craned her neck for her own look. "Interesting. I wouldn't mind seeing such a thing up close." "Yes, Princess, you would." June shook her head. "When I called them dunes, I wasn't exaggerating. The embers are piled up like sand, except they're lighter and softer, so they gets picked up by the wind much easier. Trying to see or breathe in an ashland isn't fun, not unless some rain is really coming down. We need to go around or wait for more accommodating weather." "We can't wait." Angela gave a small huff. "Very well. Pick the path you think is best." June snapped her whip to the right, and the Shirshu took off in that direction on a path that would angle around the devastation on the horizon. The creature's pace slowed within the first hour, however, as the road disintegrated into a badlands. The stone cliffs became even sharper and more sudden, and Zuko could see the obvious signs of earthbending in the structures. For there to be so many, a great battle must have been fought here. That would explain the ashland. The hours slowed. The Shirshu was doing more climbing than running, soon, and June had to bring it to a halt regularly to check their course against her compass. Each time, it seemed they had drifted back towards the ashland. Zuko looked up to find the sun at one point in the journey, and discovered that they had passed straight into the late afternoon. With each stop, the Shirshu was getting more and more off course. The air grew harsh with the smell of fresh smoke, and the horizon visible even from the cliff peaks drew shorter and shorter. It wasn't until Zuko began coughing that they realized what was going on. "Oh no," June hissed, as he brought the coughing under control. "There's ash in the air." "I thought we were going around," Angela said. "We tried, Princess. We're still going to try, but this isn't looking good." "They say dash." "Who says?" "Travelers. Other bounty hunters. Soldiers coming back from long patrols." June turned around in the saddle, and for the first time ever, Zuko saw real emotion on her face. She was worried. If Angela saw the same thing, she gave no sign. "And what do these experts say?" "That the bigger ashlands, the ones where more people died, are haunted." "And you believe this nonsense?" "I believe that people say things for a reason, Princess. Sometimes it's because those things are true and sometimes it's because people just want them to be true, but there's always something that inspired the talk. Maybe the ashlands drift more than anyone realizes, and the winds sound like spirit voices, but it's still looking like we're going to have a tough time outrunning this one." "Humph." Angela slid down off the saddle, and went back to where her luggage was lashed to the Shirshu's side. "Then we'd better prepare ourselves to handle the inevitable." She produced a silk tunic, as black as ash, and tore strips off of it. Those became masks worn over noses and mouths, and the rest of the robe became a muzzle for the Shirshu. The creature was lucky in that it didn't have eyes worth worrying about. Zuko and the others would have to simply squint at any trouble. Thus prepared, they set off again. They didn't get far before the world turned to soot around them. The winds picked up, and with them came the biting of the cinders. Even through the silk mask, the air took on the taste and smell of a pyre, and Zuko had to exert all his will just not to gag. June leaned forward in her seat, patting the Shirshu's head and shouting some encouragements to it, but the words were lost to the wind by the time they reached Zuko's ears. Azula curled up and covered her eyes, and every so often Zuko would feel her shaking with coughs. At last, Zuko had to close his good eye against the storm of ash. He wondered if he would die, here, in the howling detritus of the Fire Nation's war of conquest. They had no eyes, but nevertheless looked down through the ash, seeing the son and daughter of a traitor, the heirs of a kingdom of blood, and felt hunger. Years, months, days, hours later, Zuko felt a presence looming over him, and risked cracking his good eye open enough to look ahead. The sky was nothing more than a brownish glow behind the storm of soot. It reminded Zuko of a nightmare he had, a year or so ago, when he passed out in a heap of garbage in one of the colonies and dreamed of an endless swarm of flies. The memory made him shudder, but he forced himself to truly see the world around him, not the old nightmare. It seemed like a shadow, darker than the semi-night of the rest of the sky, was rising up ahead. He reached over Azula. She was almost bent double in her seat, the ash piling on top of her, to grab June's shoulder, and forced her to turn in the direction of the shadow. He wasn't sure if the bounty hunter was even conscious at first, but after a long moment, he felt her muscles stiffen in his grip, and she snapped her whip towards the shadow. The Shirshu, head covered by its silk muzzle, moved in that direction. It proved to be a mountain, perhaps the offspring of the one that had died farther back on the road. Even at its base, it rose steeply into the sky, and by hugging the side, at least some of the wind could be blocked. June guided her mount along the mountain's roots, and Zuko wondered if they would be doomed to circle it forever, but then they encountered a new sound, the snapping of canvas in the gales. The Shirshu took on new life, bounding towards the whisper on the wind, and before Zuko even realized what was going on, the whole group had passed beneath some kind of covering into a cave. He brushed the ash from his hair, from his face, and only when the stinging had settled into dullness did he open his eye to look around. It was indeed a cave, blocked from the outside by a canvas tarp hammered into the stone, but the chamber was larger than he expected. The ceiling was as high as the Fire Palace's Grand Hall, or at least as high as Zuko remembered it, and it stretched back beyond easy sight. Rather than growing darker in the distance, Zuko could see a glow like firelight deeper in the cave. They all dismounted, Azula finally coming back to life to hurriedly shake off the cinders that clung to her body, and then they all worked together to run their hands through the Shirshu's fur and relieve it of the weight of the accumulated ash. When that was done, they turned to regard the light in the distance. "Doesn't make any sense," June said. "No one could live in the middle of an ashland, whether or not they have a handy little cave." Azula crossed her arms over her chest. "Some of this continent's communities have advanced forms of fungus farming. If they have a water supply, there could be a settlement trapped in a network of caverns here, living off of mushrooms or some such. I say we go raid them for supplies and information." Zuko looked at the distant light, and the emptiness within howled at the sight. "I have a bad feeling about this." "Oh, well, if dear Zuzu has a bad feeling, then by all means, let's go back into that wasteland and stumble around until we die. That will be so much better." Zuko looked over at June where she was stroking the Shirshu's nose, but she shrugged at him. "The princess has a point. Even if it doesn't make sense, we don't have much choice. And there were villages in the great forest that used to be here. I guess the survivors could have taken refuge in here when the comet came and the armies fought." She stepped over to the saddle and swung herself up into it. "Besides, if there is trouble, we've got the advantage in speed and size." Zuko shook his head, but Azula ignored him and began walking deeper into the cave, towards the beckoning light. June rode the Shirshu behind her, leaving Zuko in the dark. After a moment, he hurried after them. It was a shorter walk than he expected, and soon enough the light resolved itself into torches and campfires. Each flame emitted a smoke and stench that implied rancid things about the fire's fuel. Their weak, dancing light spilled out in patches across the cave, battling against the darkness to reveal little snatches of civilization, a thin, ragged person here, a cluster of patched tents there, even one Muso lying in an alcove with struggled breathing. Everywhere Zuko looked, there were twisted and decaying reflections of his journey through the colonies. One little shadow darted away from a nearby campfire and scampered across Zuko's path. He stopped short and the shadow dashed in front of him, but he felt an impact against the toe of his boot and the figure toppled to the ground. There was a cry of a child's pain, and a little face turned back to catch the light of one of the fires. Zuko was instinctively reaching to help the child when he realized he knew that face. It was the face of his own youth. Zuko froze, unsure of his sense of reality, trying to see past the illusion to find the true face of the child on the floor in front of him. From behind, a gruff voice called out, "Where are you, boy? When I catch you I'll shove your filthy hide in the campfire and see how you talk back then." The boy gasped and scrambled away into the darkness, while Zuko stood there and tried to make himself believe that it wasn't his face on the child, it was just his single eye fooled by the low light. Eventually, he sighed and turned around to find the owner of the gruff voice stumbling into view. The man might have been heavier once, perhaps even muscular, but now his skin hung just as loosely from thin arms as his ragged clothes. He slowed when he saw Zuko and the others, his gaze coming to a stop on the Shirshu. "Fire Nation!" He spat into the darkness. "Where did you fools come from?" Azula stepped forward with her shoulders squared, and Zuko expected her to simply kill the man for his impertinence, but she merely said, "We're travelers who became lost in the Ashland. We require survival supplies, along with any other assistance which your people can offer." The man snorted. "Do we looking cracking rich to you? You want to wait out the storm, we aren't going to bother to stop you. And if you see that boy again, you tell him he better run." With that, the man whirled and shuffled back towards one of the tents. Azula threw a glance at Zuko, but he could only offer a shrug in return. They both looked to June as she slid out of her saddle and found her regular cheeky smirk back in place as she said, "Well, if we're lucky, these losers will have some hooch they can share. Let's go find out." To Zuko's relief, the refugees did not have any alcohol of any kind they could share. As soon as June learned that, she had declared that she was done for the day, and went to set up her sleeping bag beside her Shirshu, at the edge of the tent town. Unfortunately, the refugees also didn't seem to have any water, either, which was a bit more distressing. "You're sure the ash storm won't last past tomorrow morning?" Azula's question sounded more like a statement to Zuko's ears, but the old woman who had consented to share her campfire for the night yawling didn't seem to notice. She scratched at her oily gray hair and answered without ever looking at any of her guests. "Stands to reason. Only so much wind to go around, right?" Far too familiar with the sight of Azula's rolling eyes, Zuko turned his attention away from the others and to the campfire itself. It reeked just like all those in this camp, but he was growing used to the smell, to the thickness it gave to the air in the cavern. There was a smothering feeling to the atmosphere that reminded Zuko of the heavy blankets he had as a child, piled up on his little body during the cold months. He had found them oppressive in their weight, pinning him to the bed and discouraging him from movement even in his most restless sleep. Now, he experienced the memory almost like a fond dream, and felt his head growing heavy. Perhaps he would rest his eye for just a moment, close it and think back to his days in the Fire Palace, when things had been better and Azula hadn't discovered cruelty yet and Mother was there and Father. Ah! Zuko's eye snapped open at Azula's cry and he turned to find her standing, staring at a group of refugees who were passing by. "What is it?" Azula ignored him, dashing past the campfire and grabbing at one of the people. She yanked her target's arm to reveal a woman in a cloak, one Zuko did not recognize. The woman didn't seem to be alarmed by Azula's accosting, her eyes dead and posture drooping. After a moment, Azula released the woman and returned to the campfire. Yawling ignored the entire incident. Zuko shifted so that he was sitting closer to his sister. "Why did you do that?" Azula gave him a glare, but then sighed and turned to look into the flames. "I thought that woman looked familiar for a moment. It must have been the poor lighting and abysmal air quality in here." "Familiar? Who did you think she was?" Azula did not look at him. "It doesn't matter. It wasn't her, and it never will be her. Now be a good big brother and kindly shut up." It was too strange for Zuko to take any offense, Azula usually had more control than that. Unable to figure it out, he turned his own attention to the campfire, seeking the heart of the flames, the brightest and hottest point within the burning. Perhaps if he meditated, here in this soporific atmosphere, he could find the core of fire within himself. Zuko took a lotus position, tucking his legs together and extending his arms loosely, and began regulating his breathing, sending his conscious within himself. His concentration was ruined when he heard his mother ask, "Have you seen Zuko?" Zuko's eye snapped open again, but she was nowhere to be found. Instead, the same woman Azula had accosted was talking to Yawling, saying, "My son and husband were fighting again, and when I got home just now, the neighbors told me that little Shujao ran off. I can't find him anywhere." Somehow, Zuko was absolutely sure that the child he had collided with before was this missing Shujao. For her part, Yawling shrugged. "Haven't seen him. If he's missing, then he probably went into the ashlands and choked to death." Shujao's mother sighed. "That's a shame. I was hoping we'd die together." Yawling scratched at her hair again. "But choking on ash is better than starving. And this way, he won't get shoved into a campfire by his father again." Even Azula looked up at that, and the ash-streaked expression she directed at Zuko conveyed her weariness. "Is it just me," she whispered, "or are these people even stranger than the usual oppressed and traumatized peasantry?" Zuko ignored his sister, and watched as Shujao's mother began limping back the way she came. As she passed away from Yawling's campfire, the shadows writhed across her face, and when the light touched her features again, Zuko found himself watching his mother walk away in filthy refugee rags. He stood up, eliciting a grunt of surprise from Azula, and reached out for the woman. "Wait." Shujao's mother turned, and once more wore an unfamiliar face. "I'll find your son," Yawling said, "out in the ashland." "Yes." He immediately turned and headed off in the direction of June and her Shirshu, dodging the tents he found in his path. Azula came trotting up behind him and hissed, "What do you think you're doing? Risking your life for a peasant. I can't let a child die out in that ash." "Funny, that's what you've done your entire life." Surrounded by the camps of the displaced and the lowly, Zuko came to a halt and whirled on his sister, but she stared him down. "What? Did you develop a taste for rescuing children during these last few years? Or do you expect this to prove that you're the Fire Prince restored, committing acts of charity from out of the old legends?" The anger flared in Zuko's heart, but he remembered the last time he had tried to turn that against Azula. He reached within and hoped to feel the flame that had been missing for so long, but the familiar absence was the only thing he found, and he knew that could not stand against the cutting edge that was his sister. So rather than pushing up against her, he met her eyes with his one, and said, "That woman reminds me of Mother." Even in the poor light, with her face covered in the smeared filth of the ashland, he could see Azula pale at that. Why would you mention her? What do you mean? Why wouldn't I?" Azula shook her head. "She's not here. It doesn't matter what you see, she's not here." "See?" Zuko found himself grabbing his sister's arms, pulling her closer. "Did you see her, too?" Instead of an answer, he got a solid knee to the stomach, crumpling him with a sickening pain that radiated out to his whole body. When he looked up again, Azula was gone. He was alone on the floor of the cavern, ignored by people who blurred together in the dim light and went about their lives as if they had already died. At last, Zuko understood. Azula didn't understand. Mother was gone. Azula didn't even like to think about her, so there was no chance of latent psychological issues coming into play. Azula was possessed of flawless mental health, she knew because father had told her so. And yet she still saw Mother's face. Zuko had, too. There was something wrong here. Given the evidence, and with the only alternative being that Azula and Zuzu both were suddenly going insane, she was forced to revise her earlier opinion about ashlands being haunted. The only question, then, was the extent of the threat. Azula had left Zuko on the floor of the cavern, clutching his stomach. Father had charged her with taking care of her brother, of making sure he caught the Avatar and came home, and given that he had no firebending with which to protect himself against spirits, the most direct way for Azula to complete her mission would be to stay by Zuko's side. However, Azula also knew that sticking to defense was no way to win a fight. Just ask the Airbenders. She had to confront the threat, go on the offensive, and Zuko would just be a liability in that situation. Besides, this fight might very well transcend physical considerations, so staying near Zuzu might be no different than leaving him behind. And he kept talking about Mother. Azula didn't like that. When she got back to Yawling's tent, Angela marched right up to where the old woman was sitting and reached out a hand to seize complete control of the campfire. It shifted into vivid shades of blue and leaned so that the tips of the flames licked at her hand like a loyal hound. Without moving, Yawling said, "That's a neat trick. It is the purest expression of firebending that a human has ever demonstrated. Unless you want to fully understand what that means, you will answer my questions." "Seems fair." Angela took a fighting stance, ready to strike as soon as she detected a lie or a deflection. "Are you a spirit, or are you and the other filthy peasants here merely victims?" Yawling hunched forward, casting her face into shadow. "Can't say I've ever really thought about it." The lack of answer didn't bother Angela, as it was easy enough to determine by experiment. Human skin would burn at contact with fire, while spirits would, according to the legends, have their manifested forms reduced. Angela swung a hand covered in flame and aimed for Yawling's closest shoulder, something non-vital that could be damaged without threat to life. The blow was about to land when Yawling snapped her head up, and looked at Angela with mother's face. Angela's flame immediately went out, and it was just a plain fist that smacked into the bony shoulder. Then something wrapped around Angela's ankles and yanked. She fell to the ground and everything went dark when her forehead struck the stone floor. Zuko couldn't find his sister, and when he went looking for June, the bounty hunter and the Shirshu both were nowhere in the cavern. It was as though they had transformed into refugees, melding into the huddled masses sitting around the various campfires. Zuko wondered whether they would realize if such a thing had happened to them. He wondered if he himself was wearing the face of one of the refugees, and even now his sister was searching fruitlessly for him. Would she search? She said that father had sent her to bring Zuko back, and Angela always did everything that father commanded. Would father? Zuko let his doubts fade away. In this situation, they would be a liability. He felt that the only way out would be to save the boy Shujeo, and he would have to do it alone. He scrounged up enough cloth for a hood and protective mask that would protect him from the ash, grabbed a torch from one of the braziers scattered between the tents, and made his way back out of the cavern. The fire revealed a lone set of child-sized footsteps leading to the canvas tarp protecting the cave entrance, and the only thing that surprised Zuko was how unsurprised he really was. There should have been tracks from when he, Angela, and June had walked through the tunnel hours earlier, or failing that, the signs of the Shirshu's passages still should have been visible, but Zuko now understood that what he was seeing wasn't necessarily connected to reality. It was just like those stories Uncle had enjoyed telling, before he left for the North Pole. When Zuko threw aside the tarp, he found not the ashland, but the battlefield outside Ba Sing Se beneath a red sun. It was just as he remembered it. The outer wall was the most obvious feature, standing tall and solid on the horizon, massive even at this distance. The killing fields stretched out between it and Zuko, muddy and ravaged from the days and weeks and months of fighting. The landscape was just as devastated as the ashland, but at least it wasn't trying to rise up and choke anyone. Zuko lowered his torch, and pulled back his hood and mask as he wandered forward, gaze swinging back and forth in the hope of detecting any threats before they found him. He was at least fortunate in that there were no bodies on the killing fields, so it must have been a while since any fighting had taken place. He tried to reach inside for his fire but found only fear, and he withdrew from that sensation like a hand yanked from a flame. Voices carried out through the dead air, and Zuko followed them away from the outer wall. The mountain with the cave full of refugees was missing, just like the ashland itself. As he walked, he came to recognize the land around him. This was near where the army had camped during his time in service. He remembered the shape of the land, the color of the dirt beneath his feet. He picked out a shape on the horizon that he knew would be the main camp, the collection of tents where the mighty would-be conquerors of Ba Sing Se rested their heads in anticipation of a glory that would never come to them. When he had arrived with father all those years ago, he had been given a collection of tents that was more like a suite of rooms, decorated with silks and wall scrolls and weapon racks to hide the cloth nature of the walls. It was Zuko's first home away from home, the first time he had slept and lived outside of the fire palace with no exact knowledge of when he would be able to return. The sounds of voices rose and fell again in the distance with a consistent beat, rising discordant cries of exultation. Zuko's blood chilled as he recognized those calls. They were a traditional war chant, something soldiers used to prepare their hearts and minds for battle even as they strapped armor to their bodies and stretched their muscles. He had heard this specific chant for the first time just before the last battle he would ever fight in the war. Zuko's stomach clenched and his legs turned to rubber, dumping him in the dirt of the path and making him drop his torch. He shut his eye against the crimson glare of the sun and tried to push himself up, willing away the nausea that was threatening to overcome him. None of this was real, it was an illusion of a past that was dead and gone. Father wanted him back now, had sent Azula to make it happen. The Avatar was back, and Zuko would catch him. And Father was nowhere near the fighting that day. He couldn't have been. Eventually, Zuko's strength came back. He heaved himself to his feet, opened his eye, and found himself in a forest beneath a sliver of a moon and a sky filled with stars. His torch was gone. Azula sat in front of the campfire, trying to remember who Azula was. She knew, of course, that she was Azula. Her name was Azula, and that fact was not in dispute. It was a grand name, a powerful name, a name that spoke of a superlative history and proud ancestors. It was just that she couldn't remember any of that history or who those ancestors might be, and she found that worrisome. It didn't take a tactical genius to know that memory problems were never good. Azula pulled her dusty green cloak tighter, and looked around at the other people sitting around the campfire. She couldn't remember any of their names either, although their faces seemed familiar. The two who most disturbed Azula were the sad, smiling woman and the scowling man with the long thin chin beard. She feared to attract their attention, but at the same time, she craved it with a heat that warmed her skin. It wasn't as bad as with the other people: the old fat-bearded man, the young man with the white skin and blue lips, the sighing girl, the giggling girl, or even the cobweb-covered corpse that wore a flame crown in its brittle hair, but something about them all nipped at the edges of her lack of memory. It also felt like someone was missing, but she couldn't imagine who. Perhaps they were all waiting for him. Why was she so sure it was a him? Zuko had no idea what forest he was in, but he could no longer see any signs of the Ba Sing Se landscape, and that was some small comfort. It was hard going at first, making his way through the forest. With such a small moon, barely any light made its way down through the clusters of little leaves. Zuko stumbled his way from tree to tree, occasionally calling out for Shujao with as much hope of finding the boy as he had that the boy would find him first. But slowly, Zuko realized there was more light to work with than that of the moon and the stars. As his eye adjusted, he could detect a faint luminescence in the trunks of the trees themselves, allowing them to stand out from the darkness around them. It felt like he was wandering for hours, but things became more distinct as time passed, until the entire forest was reflected in dim shades of gray. With the ability to see came the knowledge that he was being hunted. It was a human, or something shaped like it. The silhouette was shapeless, but the figure was the same general size as a human, taller than it was wide, and it moved like a person, albeit with uncanny grace. Zuko bided his time, letting his eye become more and more attuned to the dim light, letting his ears learn the sounds of the hunter's whispering movements. When he judged that his perceptions were as good as they were going to get in this forest, and he more or less had an idea of the hunter's position, he bent his path to take him around a copse of tall trees. In that instant when he was lost to the hunter's sight, Zuko turned and took an attack stance, ready to leap on his stalker as soon as the figure stumbled into his trap. He hadn't expected the hunter to double back around the other side of the copse of trees. Zuko's only warning was a whistle through the air, and he jumped away just into time to avoid the flying talons made of shadow itself that almost landed in his back. He quickly turned to face his attacker, and in the glow of the nearby tree trunks, he could finally get a good look at her. The woman was young, Zuko's age or perhaps a little younger, with skin so pale it almost glowed in the night. The face was the only part of her that was easily distinctive from her surroundings, as her hair and cloak were both the darkest black. There was something familiar about her, and it wasn't until she moved and threw another set of shadow talons with a snapping motion as fast as lightning that he realized who she was. The throwing style was almost as much of a giveaway as the girlish oxhorn buns style in which she wore her hair. Mai was all grown up, now. The realization slowed Zuko, and he couldn't dodge this latest set of projectiles. They bit into his clothes but didn't slow, their speed fighting back against his inertia and winning enough to drag and pin him against a tree. Zuko tried to pull away, but his clothing resisted and the talons this close to the glowing bark, he could see that they were shards of volcano glass, refused to relinquish their hold in the tree. Zuko's continued pulling tore at his clothes, but before he could rip free, Maya was standing right in front of him holding a dagger beneath his chin, the blade a sanded and polished work of black volcano glass. Her eyes met Zuko's single one, and he felt his face burning in shame. What are you doing here?" She tilted her head and shrugged, pushing her cloak to fall back off her shoulders, revealing the pure white funeral garb she wore beneath. "Isn't it obvious? I'm here to mourn for you, Prince Zuko. You'll fail to find the boy Shujao, and then you will die in fire." Chapter 12, Zuko's War. Aang didn't quite understand, yet, the full nature of being the Avatar. It came with responsibilities and powers that he was only beginning to taste. So it was hard, sometimes, to say when he simply had a bad feeling like everybody else got, or when some perception granted by the Avatar spirit was detecting a manifestation beyond her normal ken. How much was imagination, and how much was wisdom from beyond his humanity? Nevertheless, Aang had woken up just now, in the middle of the night, with the distinct impression that his Avatar sense was tingling. He was sleeping as he usually did, atop Appa's head in the great outdoors, beside the hut where a healer lived and worked near Chin village. Grass shifted in the soft breeze, and the road in the distance was completely deserted. Aang slid down from Appa and snuck around to the front of the hut. Sokka's tent was pitched nearby, and the older boy was presumably inside, dreaming about killer food or something like that. Aang turned to the hut itself, and leaned his head through the entrance. The only light within came from the glow of the moon and stars through the windows, casting just enough illumination to reveal the pallet where Maya was sleeping, recovering from the burns she had received on Kyoshi Island. She was tossing and turning beneath her blanket, which Aang didn't think was good. The healer had said that Maya needed to avoid moving, so that the skin of her side could heal properly. On the other hand, she also needed her rest, so waking her up in the middle of the night wouldn't be good, either. Aang compromised by tiptoeing up to her, thinking to perhaps straighten blanket or something soothing, but as he approached, she rolled over again, muttering and breathing laboriously. Was she having a bad dream? Aang leaned over her, unable to help noticing that her normally shining hair was matted with sweat. She spoke again, and this time, Aang caught the word, Zuko, fire. What was a Zuko? A Fire Nation term. Something to do with her injury? Before Aang could decide what to do, he heard a familiar cooing, and Momo flew into the hut through a window to land right on top of Mai's blanket. The lemur turned in a quick circle before settling down as if to sleep, and Mai immediately calmed. Her breathing slowed, and the tenseness in her form faded. Aang waited a little longer to confirm it, but she seemed to be okay now, sleeping peacefully, and no longer moving. Satisfied at his luck, he headed back to Appa, looking forward to his own sleep. If Maya was feeling well, they'd have to move on in the morning, in case word of their visit got back to the Fire Nation. A fight would be the last thing Maya needed. Pinned to a tree by shards of volcano glass in a glowing forest that couldn't be real, Zuko's mind was racing as he tried to make sense of things. In front of him stood a woman who could only be Mai, the girl from a place of memory in his heart where even he feared to tread, brandishing a black glass knife and claiming to be here for his death. How can you be here? Where is here? Oh, Prince Zuko. There's so much you don't understand. Mai lowered the knife and stuck her tongue out at him. Destiny knew what it was doing when it gave your little sister more than the usual share of brains. Too bad you didn't bring her along. She pulled her cloak back over her white funeral garb and pranced over to a copse of trees, coming to lean against one of the trunks and turning sultry eyes back to Zuko. I'm here to save you, my prince. My body and heart are yours forever. There was no doubt that she was beautiful, surpassing all the fantasies that Zuko had ever conjured of what Maya would be once she left childhood behind, but all he felt from this sight was a coldness that calmed his mind and revealed the answers he had been seeking. You're not Maya. How can you say that? You haven't even tasted me yet. There's more to humans than how they look. There is. Much more. Huh. The thing that was not Mai stood up straight again and raised her hands to touch her face. You humans give so much weight to how things look, I thought that it was all you care about. Too bad I couldn't borrow her full personality as well, but I like her manner of speaking. She skipped over to Zuko and placed a hand warm through his clothes, almost burning on his chest. Their faces were so close that he could feel her sweet breath on his lips as she whispered, would it hurt more if I tore out your heart while wearing this face? Zuko did what he did best and completely ignored the uncomfortable question. What is going on? Why are you doing this? Why? Not Mai backed away from him again, cocking her head to the side and giving him a confused stare. Now you're just messing with me. I know humans are experts in revenge. You love it more than you love each other. Revenge for what? Oh, why limit it? Not Mai smiled and licked her lips. Your nation has had 100 years to accumulate guilt for what it's done to the entire world. Let's not devalue that kind of effort by pinning it down in the form of a list. It was as Zuko suspected. You were the spirit of this forest. You want revenge for the Ashland. A spirit of the forest, you ignoramus. Do you think all that ash came from a handful of trees? The forest stretched from horizon to horizon. Entire villages of humans lived in its comfort, so far apart that they forgot about each other centuries ago, and did homage to a variety of spirits. And yet they all contributed to the one army that marched off to save the land of Earth. Not Mai giggled. You probably would have liked that army. It was very, very big, and they all had nice shiny armor. You humans love things that are big and shiny. But then again, your people chased them back to this forest, and then used the power of the comet to kill every last soldier, so maybe you wouldn't have liked it so much. You're not supposed to burn the things you like. She stepped forward and caressed the scar on Zuko's face. Right. Zuko yanked away, finally ripping his clothes enough to tear away from the shards of volcano glass that had been pinning him to the tree. He took an attack stance and faced his opponent. Not Mai shook her hands free from her cloak and planted them on her hips. I didn't think scars were so sensitive, she said, winking. Are you going to talk me to death, or are you going to get this revenge you want? You're right. The night is old, and if we're going to get this done, we need to do it before your patron lights up the sky again. Not Mai raised a hand above her head and a shaft of moonlight broke through the forest's canopy to light her up. She swung her hand out, and Zuko tensed for an attack. As she pointed off to her left. That way. Zuko blinked, and looked where she was pointing. It was just more of this spirit forest. That way for what? The boy you're looking for. Shujao. He went that way. Off you go. I want to see your cute little butt bouncing along in that direction. Quickly, now. Zuko didn't relax out of his stance. I thought you wanted revenge. You're trying to send me in the wrong direction. Wow. I can see why your Mai likes you so much. Humans love the chance to nurture and control other humans. Not Mai pushed her cloak back fully, once again revealing the white mourning robes beneath, undyed and unsullied. They were robes without life, but also robes on which anything could be written, the turning point of the reincarnation cycle. There is no wrong direction here, Prince Zuko. Either you will fail in your search, and wander the Ashland until you choke to death in the foulness of your own people, or you will succeed in your quest to rescue Shujao, and walk into the bright world once more, ruined by the experience. Ask your sister sometime about the strategic importance of no-win situations. I doubt you'll understand, but it should make her happy, at least. Not Mai yanked her black cloak off and tossed it at Zuko's face. He grabbed it in midair and pulled it away so that it wouldn't entrap him, removing it from his vision so that he was only left blind for less than a second. And the spirit that had been wearing Mai's face was gone. Zuko got moving a moment later in the same direction that the spirit had pointed, leaving the cloak behind, and found a path through the underbrush of the forest, a dirt path on which child-sized footsteps led off into the night. Zuko walked for years until he came to a fork in the path. It split neatly, with a thick swath of trees down the middle, the two new paths completely invisible to each other. Zuko looked for the tracks, and found them leading clearly down the path on his right. It was so clear that he expected a trick, and scouted the left path for a short distance to make sure that the tracks wouldn't magically switch. Eventually, he decided to go back and take the right path, and turned around to find his mother walking towards him. Zuko jolted to a stop and blinked his one good eye, but the vision didn't change. His mother was walking slowly down the path in her old red and gold cloak, her hood up and her head bowed. Beside her was a darker figure, matching her pace, and as the pair approached, Zuko's stomach clenched. He recognized the person walking beside his mother, and realized what Not My had meant by this experience being ruinous. The person escorting his mother was Piandao, his father's trusted servant. It was exactly like the last time Zuko had ever seen his mother. He backed away from the approaching figures, one step at a time, and as he walked, the packed dirt of the path hardened, and his boots clacked against the polished marble of the Fire Palace's courtyard. Zuko whirled, finding a mix of the familiar and the foreign, the palace he had grown up in looming above him even while the glowing trees of the spirit forest refused to give way, standing incongruously in the palace courtyard and blocking the longer view with their leaves. Mother and Piandao were close enough that their own footsteps were now clacking on the marble as well, and Zuko turned to face them. He couldn't let this be like all those years ago. "Mother," he called out, and realized with dismay that it had been the same opening he had used back then as well. Mother looked up at last at the sound of his voice, and she once more wore the same wary expression beneath her hood. She moved towards Zuko, but Piandao stepped to block her path and said, "Prince Zuko, what are you doing out here so late? Getting in some extra fire-bending practice?" That was indeed what he had been doing, the first time, but this was different. He was in this forest to save Shujao, but perhaps he could save Mother as well. "Where are you taking her?" "This has nothing to do with you, my prince. Go back inside, go to bed, and everything will be fine." Piandao was repeating himself like a memory, but this time Zuko would not just stand there in confusion. Even his mother was nodding, saying, "Don't worry yourself about me. Good night, Zuko. I will always protect you." Zuko was moving forward, advancing on Piandao. He might not have his fire bending, but he was a man now, and he wasn't afraid of father's thug. He could fight, even without fire, and would save his mother. 5 steps from where Zuko planned to begin his attack, Piandao drew a Jian sword from its scabbard and pointed the blade directly at Zuko's face. Strangely, the blade was not metal. Zuko had seen Piandao's sword many times in his youth, during all those court demonstrations of trick sword play. The sword had a metal blade, no different from any other Jian. This sword had a blade of black volcano glass, twinkling in the light of the moon and the stars and the luminescent trees. Zuko tried to twist and dash around the blade, but Piandao moved to block him, slicing the sword across his path. Piandao's footwork kept his body between Zuko and Mother, his sword held out in an effective guard position. Zuko feinted to his left, and then tried to circle around the other way, but Piandao tilted the long blade to cut him off, and then let loose a flurry of stabs that made Zuko stumble backwards to avoid having his chest poked full of holes. He stumbled when he found not the flat marble of the courtyard, but a dip in the packed dirt of the forest path, and fell to the ground. Piandao drew his sword back even before Zuko finished his tumble. When he looked up again, Piandao was once more leading Mother deeper down the path. The Fire Palace was gone. As they moved away, rain began falling from a completely clear sky. It started with a drop that smacked down on Zuko's head. As he got to his feet, other drops fell loudly around him. Zuko hurried after his mother, and the rain became denser, wind blowing it with extra strength to lash coldly. Before he could reach Mother, Zuko realized that the rain was going to wash away Shujao's tracks on the other path. Mother and Piandao continued on their way, not even looking back, moving briskly in the rain. Zuko was sure he could catch them, but what would he do then? Could he fight Piandao? Could he convince Mother to flee? Was any of it even real? Zuko realized that this was the trick of the spirit forest. It was taunting him with failure, trying to sway him from his goal. A little refugee boy would be lost in this nightmare forever, and it would be Zuko's fault. With one last look at his departing mother, Zuko turned and headed back for the fork in the path, to take the option that would actually let him save someone. At the end of the path, as the rain trickled to a stop, Zuko found a familiar house and Not My waiting for him. He was ashamed that his eyes fell on Not My first where she was lounging on the forest floor, her black cloak spread beneath her. She looked up at him, her funeral robes in disarray and falling from her bare shoulders, and cooed, "Hello, sailor." Behind her, a man's tortured scream rang out from the house, and a shudder moved up Zuko's spine. Not My rolled over to lie on her back and continued, "Oh, but that's right, you're not a sailor. Not anymore. How long did your glorious captaincy last? 3 days? 4. More speech came from the house, worried and urgent, but another scream, the same familiar voice, drowned them out. Zuko found his hands tightening into fists. I was captain for almost 2 weeks. We visited the Western Air Temple, and then sailed for the Earth Kingdom. We visited several ports in the colonies. And then they sent you ashore to ask your questions about arrow tattoos and ran for the setting sun, fleeing the sour tongue of their prince. Not Mai giggled, twisting on her cloak. I suppose your crew became pirates. Your nation has no love for deserters, even if the captain the left behind was just a boy whining for his mother's bosom. Zuko reached down, grabbed the cloak spread on the ground, and yanked it from beneath Not Mai, spinning and spilling her onto the mud. She laughed as Zuko marched past her and dragged the cloak along the ground, ruining both sides of it before casting it in a puddle. He approached this ominous house in his path, and as he really looked at it for the first time, he sucked in a pained breath. He knew this place. It wasn't just a home, it was a small clinic, a place of healing for its village, though the village itself was nowhere to be seen in this forest. The scream rang out again from within, and Zuko hurried to the door and slid it open. It was bright inside, thanks to the combination of crystal lamps and flame lanterns that were hung in clusters from the ceiling. The people who worked here needed as much light as possible when surgery was necessary, and it seemed to be necessary now. 2 large men were holding a thrashing patient down on the central table, while a woman worked on the man's face, blocking it from Zuko's view. A second woman was mixing something at a table off to the side, furiously grinding herbs and calling, "I'm making more." The first woman, her hair close-cropped but her hanbok flaring out as she turned, shouted back, "No. He's had too much already. He's burning it right out of his own blood. He'll have to just ride this out." The patient thrashed again beneath her, and Zuko finally noticed the man's hands. They were battered, bloody, and filthy, but not yet calloused. And little tongues of flames danced across them, not yet bursting into sustained fire. One of the large assistants glanced at the patient's hands, and then back at the first woman. "Song, how much longer? The infection runs deep. I think I'm going to have to take the eye." She did something that made the patient scream again, and this time, when he flung his hands out, a burst of fire popped into the air. The assistant said, Maybe we can take a break first." The woman Song shook her head and took a deep breath. "If the infection gets to his brain." She trailed off as she got back to work, and the patient roared. Zuko was leaning against the wall, not trusting his legs to support him. He knew this clinic. After he had been marooned in the colonies by his traitorous crew, he had continued his quest to find the Avatar on his own, but he had little in the way of supplies, and his money had run out quickly. He hadn't been able to change the bandages on his eye, not with anything clean enough for the job, and soon the fevers had set in, but he didn't let that stop him on his quest, pushing on to the Eastern Air Temple, sure that there would be some clues there as to the Avatar's location. He had found this clinic when he wandered into a remote peasant village, and it was the last thing he saw before he blacked out. He couldn't quite remember what happened when he woke up. There had been fire, and he ran from it. Song gasped and stepped back from the table. "Done. Bandages." The other woman quickly stepped in, wrapping the patient's face as the assistants held him down, and Zuko watched Song go to a bowl of water and wash the blood off her hands. So far, no one had taken notice of him. He began to doubt that they would, and he no longer felt any need to see this. Outside, he found Not Mai waiting. Her funeral robes were stained with mud, no longer pure, but her skin and hair were unsullied. "Why come back out? The path led here, and the rain has washed away the tracks, so the people inside are your best bet for finding poor abused Shujeo. I suppose you could always just take your best guess and start walking through the forest, but I think that's entirely missing the spirit of this whole thing. No pun intended, I think. It's hard to tell with this face I'm wearing." The clinic was quiet now, but Zuko's worry didn't decrease. His fragmentary memory burned in his mind, and the echoes of terrified shrieks rang in his ears. The clinic was quiet now, but he wondered for how long. Not Mai grinned at him and hugged herself, caressing her bare shoulders. "That song seemed very nice. Whatever happened to her? She worked so hard to protect that useless brain of yours. I hope you rewarded her properly for her efforts." Zuko turned and ran back into the clinic. It was darker than before, with only a single crystal lantern left uncovered. The others must have departed, leaving only Song and the patient. He was lying on a pallet, his head mostly covered with bandages, while she precisely bathed his fevered brow with a cloth so that the dressings didn't get wet. It didn't look easy, with the patient shifting and muttering, but Song's patience seemed to know no bounds. Zuko resolved to find a clue to Shujeo's whereabouts as fast as possible, before. Even in the low light, the muddy child-sized tracks were visible on the floor. They led right to the patient's pallet and stopped, but Zuko felt no need to follow them. He searched the ground in the general area around the tracks, running his hands over the dark floorboards, and was rewarded with the touch of metal against his fingers. Zuko grasped his find and raised it up close to his eye, so that the object would catch the light, and discovered that he was holding a pin made in the shape of the Fire Nation sigil. It was pure gold, making it a decoration that by law was reserved only for officers with noble blood. That it was shaped as a symbol of the Fire Nation itself meant this specific token belonged to someone whose whole person represented the homeland. Zuko had worn a token just like this, in Ba Sing Se. It had been a gift from his uncle. A pained groan broke Zuko out of his reverie. The patient was stirring on his pallet, and Zuko couldn't stop himself from turning to look. Song was holding the patient down. "Don't move, sir. You're weak, and if you get up dash." "Not weak." With that roar came a burst of flames, and Song fell screaming to the floor, the damage to her hands obscured by the steam pouring off of them. Zuko leaped to his feet and positioned himself in front of Song, facing down the patient as the bandaged man pushed up off the pallet. The patient advanced, his single visible eye unfocused, probably not even seeing Zuko. But Zuko could see him. Or rather, Zuko could see his own past self. The other one lunged, fire flaring to life on his hands, but Zuko was quick, grabbing his other self around the wrists and inhaling sharply. He didn't even realize that he was trying to firebend until the flames went out at his instinctual command, and poisonous warmth flowed into the chi lines of his arms. The thread ended, he yanked, and threw his past self across the clinic, disgusted at the very sight of the wild, bandaged face. The other's body crashed against the table stacked with herbs and medicines, and he collapsed to the floor. Zuko waited, but the other didn't move again. Zuko crouched down beside Song, needing to see how badly she was injured. She was sobbing, holding her shaking arms out in front of her as though she couldn't make herself move them, and Zuko forced himself to examine the burned skin. It looked terrible, would at least leave rough red scars all over her hands and arms, and could very well lead to the arms having to be amputated. Song had her tearing eyes shut against the sight, and as she sobbed, Zuko reached out and took her burned hands in his own. Once again, that corrosive heat flowed into his arms, and before his eyes, time passed like the rapids of a rushing river, and Song's injuries became old scars. Her cries stopped and her tears dried, and she opened her eyes to look at Zuko and smile. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded. "I know." When Zuko stood and made to leave, his past self was gone. The flame sigil pin did not tell Zuko what path he needed to take, but he was beginning to understand something about this place. The path itself wasn't real, it was a series of tricks to guide Zuko to these waypoints of his history. The forest itself wasn't even a forest, but rather a labyrinth that was shaping him into the person he needed to be to find the exit. It was less a maze and more a process, with Zuko himself as the result. Zuko was the result, and he was the path. He needed to know where to go within himself, and then he would find Shujeo. And the pin told him exactly where the boy was waiting. Zuko strode through the forest with confidence. The glow of the trees no longer mattered, as he could find his way now even with his one eye closed. Instead, he sought for the fear, the confusion, the pain he had felt when he first stumbled out of the refugee cave and into the illusions of the ashland. When he had first left in search of Shujeo, in search the boy who ran from the terrors of an abusive father, Zuko had found himself in a world that looked like the battlefield outside Ba Sing Se. Looking for the swirl of emotions that he had felt when he first saw the outer wall, the killing fields, the Fire Nation camp, Zuko could find his way back to that illusion. And so he passed around an especially thick copse of trees and was suddenly walking in the village of tents that made up the Fire Nation's base on the front lines of the conquest of Ba Sing Se. Soldiers were moving around, some of them injured, some of them with the unfocused stare of the battle fatigued, all of them covered with the dust of landscape. Barked orders rang out and mixed with echoing groans of pain, and there was the metallic taste of defeat in the air. Zuko did not recognize this specific vantage point, but he knew the scene well. Father had finally showed some confidence in Zuko and given him the 41st Division to assault the outer wall. They had been given catapults, and explosives, and archers, and orders to hold position until sunset, when Father promised that a surprise would be waiting. Zuko had taken his troops and directed them to concentrate the full might of the Fire Nation against the outer wall and its barbarian defenders. An hour later, they were running in retreat. Zuko wandered through the camp, wary of whatever twisted surprise the spirits had in store for him. Even so, it didn't strike him as at all out of the ordinary when one lieutenant came up to him, bowed, and said, "Your Highness, the camp is deserted. We couldn't find either Prince Ozai or any of the commanders." Zuko turned an incredulous stare to the soldier. "What? Were they ambushed while we were gone?" There are no signs of battle, my prince, and all the equipment needed for an attack was taken." And Zuko realized what was going on. "We were a distraction." You didn't know?" "Your Highness." Zuko looked down at his feet. "No. What was he doing?" He did know. Not at the time he led the attack, but after he had already realized this years ago. This wasn't happening now. This was another echo of the past. Zuko looked at the lieutenant speaking to him, and saw that the man wasn't wearing armor at all, but rather the green rags of the Ashland refugees. There was no sharp Fire Nation beard on the man's chin, but rather gray, uneven stubble. Zuko looked around him. All the soldiers here were refugees, men and women dying a slow death in a cave in a mountain in an ashland. The sky and land around them might be that of Ba Sing Se, but the people were not the same as that day, years ago. But where was Shujao? With a sickening lurch of realization, Zuko knew exactly. No sooner did the truth blossom in his mind than the refugees were once again armored soldiers, and those who could were all running, answering the call to arms sounded by the horns of their commanders. As they fell into ranks, Zuko could see squad leaders waving directions at their subordinates, shouting, "Form up! Back to the wall! And, double time, march! And, Prince Zuko has ordered us to support his father's assault on the wall." It was happening again. When Zuko had discovered that his true mission was to be a distraction, he had taken a spyglass and rode with some scouts back to the wall, and sure enough, found another battle going on at the outer wall's northeastern side, behind the curve of the wall where Zuko wouldn't have been able to see it while he and the 41st conducted their own assault. He and the scouts had met a group of injured who were retreating, telling of mounting casualties and increased resistance, and Zuko knew that it was his fault, that he hadn't been able to hold position as he was ordered and split the attention of the wall's defenders. So he did the only thing he could do, in the face of his failure. He had led his troops to reinforce his father. Now, Zuko ran after the soldiers. He had to find Shujao, and if he had any sense of the way this farce was being conducted, the boy would be exactly where Zuko himself had been years ago, in the saddle of a Komodo dragon at the head of the charge. Somehow, Zuko was able to run faster than the soldiers. No, they were once again refugees, stumbling along on bleeding feet to rescue father. He outpaced Komodo rhinos that became bloated moose, and the dusty landscape whirled around him, becoming ash and forest and mountains and finally mud. He arrived at the foot of the outer wall to find the battle fully joined, Fire Nation soldiers wearing the Phoenix badge of his father's personal command fighting alongside ash-streaked refugees against Earth Kingdom soldiers and laughing shadows. Death was all around him, but he had to find father. No, Shujao. No, himself. He arrived at the heart of the fighting, where father and his squad of guards were clustered in a defensive formation, holding back the spears of the enemy, and Zuko saw a Komodo rhino ride into the fray, driven by a little boy with Zuko's old face, dressed in rags with gold flame sigil pins on his collar. The boy was throwing fire from his fists at the enemy, no form or discipline in his attack, just pure desperation to save his father. The spearmen shifted against the surprise assault, and Zuko. Shujao. Zuko made himself look for Ozai, and instead found Shujao's father, the old shuffling man with loose skin and thin bones, standing in the midst of the Phoenix Guard. The man raised a fist and summoned a flame, and surely he was going to help his son, to strike at the Earth Kingdom soldiers that were their common enemy. It was a risky move, because aim could be off and shots could miss, but... Father's gaze was fixed on Zuko. Shujao. A fist was flung forward. The fire arced with a perfect, precise curve. No, the report said friendly fire from one of the Phoenix Guard. Grandfather said it was an accident, and so not serviceable punishment for a coward who disobeyed orders and fled from a battle. Azula said that father wanted him back now. The fireball slammed into Shujao's face and knocked him right out of the rhino's saddle. Zuko screamed and fell to his knees, and the battle froze around him. Not Mai's laughter rang out over the newly quiet battlefield, and she sauntered into view with her funeral robes on full display, once more straightened and in place, perfectly white and glowing with cleanliness amidst the dusty and bloody warriors. "Well," she said when she was finished chuckling. "That was informative. And here I thought you were going to run away, or at least close that eye of yours, but no, you took in the whole view and never thought about denying it. You've won a modicum of my respect, Prince Zuko." She came to a stop in front of Zuko and laid her muddy cloak over his shoulders, soiling him with the filth of the battlefield. Zuko didn't move as she bent down and kissed his brow. Her hands stroked his face, and as Zuko closed his eye against the assault, she whispered, "Take solace in this face, and let me take your pain away." Zuko rose and wrapped her in his arms, held her close against him, and willed the fire in his heart to come to life. For the first time since he burned Song, the flame in his heart responded, and not Mai screamed as the fire ate at her illusion of flesh. Her body convulsed and she let go of Zuko. He felt no need to continue holding her up, so he allowed her writhing to twist her out of his grip, and she dropped to the mud. Her funeral robes had burned away, but instead of Mai's pale flesh, scorched, wart-covered green skin was revealed. Zuko waited, holding the flames within. Not Mai eventually looked up. "You could have just said you weren't in the mood." Zuko took an attack stance, a fire-bending position that would let him go on the offensive in an instant. "How do I get out of here? I saw your little show, and now I need to be on my way. Do I have to kill you to make the illusion end?" Not Mai barked a laugh, but it immediately made her cringe and twist with pain. "Ow. Don't make me giggle. If the way out really was to kill me, then do you really think I would tell you? You've come so far tonight. Don't ask stupid questions. HNNNG. So be it." Zuko drew a fist back, ready to end this spirit with one clean blow. "Wait. Don't." Shujao ran up out of the forest of frozen soldiers and grabbed Zuko's arm. Zuko pulled back in surprise. Was the boy real, then? He had started to think that Shujao was just part of the illusion, or was this another trick of the spirits? The boy looked up with the same face that Mother had so gently caressed when she was still alive. "The spirit won't have any power over you when the sun comes up. Just leave it. Take me back to my home." Zuko blinked, trying to shake the vision of his own face, to see what this boy really looked like. "Your father, I saw what he did. I can't take you back." "Then why do you want to go back so badly?" The flame within Zuko snuffed out in an instant, and a chill breeze licked at his fingers. The cold spread from his heart all along his chi lines, racking his body with shivers. Why did he want to go back? He had seen the truth here, but how much of it was real? Zuko's memories had informed all the lies that had been built for his torture, but he didn't actually remember what happened in that battle. He had been fighting, and then he had been struck, and he knew no more until he awoke later. Perhaps it really had been an accident, perhaps father hadn't even been the one responsible, and that old nightmare of the glimpse he got out of the corner of his eye was just childish fear that the spirits had given form for their amusement. It might not be true at all. And yet it had felt true, a moment ago. But Azula said that father wanted him back. That father regretted the banishment that grandfather had placed as a result of the accusation. Either way, Zuko could not shrink away from his path. He had wasted the last few years of his life, and couldn't continue to live in fear and failure forever. One way or another, Zuko would embrace his father, and take his rightful place as a prince of the Fire Nation. The warmth of that thought flooded Zuko's body, and it was a simple matter to punch, exhale, and set not my on fire. She burned as though made of wood, completely engulfed in an instant as she screamed and hissed and smoked. The flames spread to the ground around her, mud turned to dried leaves and dead branches, and soon a bonfire was roaring in front of Zuko. He backed away, knowing he had to assert control over the flames, but his heart was beating and the heat was boiling his blood, and now the soldiers were all trees and the outer wall was the canopy of leaves above his head, and the fire was spreading and the forest was burning, and Shujao screamed as he burned, too. The world became flame, and Zuko succumbed to the heat. He awoke in complete darkness, and before he could think about it, he raised a hand and summoned a flame to light the way. Zuko was in the cave, the heart of the mountain in the heart of the ashland, and it was a place of death. No torches fouled the air, and no people gave dying life to the place. The remnants of a camp were strewn all over the place, but they were covered in dust and mold and hardened wolf bat droppings, well on their way to nothingness. Here and there were bones as well, and Zuko looked carefully to make sure there were no signs of burning on them. However long ago this camp had lived, its remnants were undisturbed. He found Azula, June, and the Shirshu at the center of what had been the camp, all of them huddled together in sleep. He awoke June first, since she would be needed to keep her animal companion calm, and when she looked up at Zuko, she said, "Forsaken Ashland. Is it over?" Zuko nodded in the light of his flame. "Good." June then got up and began seeing to the Shirshu, while Zuko went on to his sister. She was cringing in her sleep, her body was tense, and it was with great care that he woke her, calling her name and being sure not to touch her. Her eyes snapped open and her hands formed fists, but when she saw Zuko, she relaxed. Marginally. Azula got her feet and dusted herself off before she spoke. "So, was it truly caused by spirits?" Zuko nodded. "I don't know if I chased them off or destroyed them, but they seem to be gone now. We should get out of here while the sun is up. I think it will help protect us from whatever might still be here." June cracked her whip. "Don't have to tell me twice, Prince Zuko. Let's saddle up." The ashland they found outside was without power. A rain must have fallen during the night, for when the Shirshu bounded out of the cave, it was into a shining sun and onto a muddy terrain that was content to stay where it was and not attempt to ride the breeze. If the Shirshu was having trouble with the slippery, gritty ground, it gave no sign, and made great time as it loped as fast as it could. While they rode, Azula turned to look at Zuko in the saddle and said, "I couldn't help but notice that you were firebending back there. I assume that you resolved your problem while dealing with, well, whatever you were dealing with." Zuko took deep breath, focusing on the air's passage through his nostrils and down into the lungs where it became fuel for his chi. He could feel the chi within his body, the network of energy that stretched throughout his fibers and touched the edge of spirit. It was stronger now than it had been in years, thanks to his body's restoration over the last month, and the flame within answered his call and flared out along the paths of energy. Zuko exhaled a thin stream of smoke, and looked at his sister. "I'm once again who I should be." "Excellent. Well, it's as grandfather always says, that which doesn't kill you just makes you stronger. I suppose that goes for spirits, as well." Zuko thought back to his quest, and how Shujao. No, how he himself had burned. I suppose it does. And he would have to be strong, if he was going to defeat the Avatar. Chapter 13, Riddles in the Daylight. More. The old man lifts a teapot. Aang nods and holds out his cup. "Please. This is really good. It is a Longjing green tea." The old man purrs, tipping his rotund body so that he leans over the little table resting on the grass between him and Aang. "It was served at my parents' wedding, and I drank it for the first time after my mother's funeral." The sadness of that thought spears Aang's heart, and the sky above him darkens sympathetically. The grass beneath him grows stiff and lifeless. "I'm sorry." "Thank you. But I didn't mean to make this conversation about me and my family. Please, catch me up on what you have been doing." The old man's eyebrows rise. "How has your lady friend been?" Aang covers his smile with a sip of his tea, and the sun breaks out into a comforting shine. "Mai's doing much better. She says the burn is all healed, and she's been exercising to make sure she's not stiff. I watched her yesterday, and she was looking really good. I meant that her moves were really good." She still never misses with her knives. The old man chuckles. Well, what do you expect of a weapon of the Fire Nation? Hey, that's something I've been wondering. What does it mean, being a weapon? Ah. The old man takes a long sip of his tea, and then sets the cup down. Yes, you would have been sleeping for that. It began about 30 years ago, now. We always revered firebenders and the glory of combat, but as the Fire Nation took more and more of the war into its spirit, the more value warriors of all kinds had to our people. The greatest, the ones who can do what no one else can, the ones with the skill of an entire army, were declared by the Fire Lord to be destined tools of their homeland. And so a select few are chosen for their skill, awarded the title of Weapon of the Fire Nation, and drafted into the royal family's lifelong service. They become property, their entire lives devoted to the cause, but in return they are given power and prestige. Piandeo Clanless was the first, and your friend Mai is one of a new, growing generation of weapons. Aang looks down at the dregs of his tea, thinking about that. Mountains rise up on the horizon, blocking his view of the sea, and the air grows still. No wonder she betrayed the Fire Nation. She was pretty much a slave, even if she did get rewards. Just like Sokka. Is that your water tribe ally? Yeah, he's my friend. He came up with the big plan to free me at the South Pole, and now I'm helping him find his sister. Aang leans over the table and whispers, she's a waterbender, and we found out that the Fire Nation is keeping her somewhere called Crescent Island. Mai says that it's shaped like a crescent moon, which makes sense. We're actually on a mission to rescue her right now. Oh, Crescent Island. The old man finishes his tea and sets his cup down. His gaze loses focus, and his next words come out slowly. Even with a sky bison, Crescent Island will be difficult to visit. As you would expect from a waterbender prison surrounded by the ocean, security is very high. A small fleet patrols the island at all times, and it is very watchful. If you simply fly in, you will be seen, and the prison will be locked down. Oh. The grass turns to sand beneath Aang, and the sun becomes a dull, frigid light in the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a howl echoes across the desert plains. What are we going to do now? The old man strokes his chin, tugging on his beard. I have some associates who may be able to help, and will want to. They are based in the far east of the Earth Kingdom, and have access to certain resources. Yes, I think that will do nicely. They are in need of a real purpose, and the Avatar shall give them one. Then, once you've freed your friend's sister, perhaps I can help give you a purpose. A favor for a favor. Aang hops to his feet. It isn't as smooth as he usually manages, since he can't airbend here, but the sands beneath him change to a nice thick moss that cradles his feet and shifts to balance him. That's great. Thanks so much. How do I find these friends of yours? First, you need to go to the Ujia province, near the city of Tati. From there, the bones of the earth will show the way. Ever falling, ever frothing, the land is sobbing and eyes are watching. Reverse the running, walk the wall, and know the stranger in the sandstone. And then when the waterbender is freed, I would like you to return the favor by seeking dash. Wake up. Aang's eyes snapped open, and he sat up on Appa's tail. He thought he had heard someone shouting at him, but there was no one in sight in the early dawn light. Sokka's tent was still closed up and echoing with heavy snores, while Mai's tent was as silent as one of the earth tombs of Gohosian. Even Appa was still asleep. Actually, the only active creature in the entire forest glade was Momo, perched at Aang's feet and looking up with interested lemur eyes. Of course, Momo couldn't talk, so he couldn't have been the one shouting. Aang decided that he must have dreamed it. Dreamed. He remembered some of his dream. There had been tea, and something about the Ujia province? Aang yawned, and decided that it wasn't important enough to stay awake. He plopped back down and let himself drift back into a slumber. Even stretched out, the skin never lost its rough quality. The fingers that brushed over the pale mottling found a smoothness that was unexpected, given its appearance, but not the clean, continuous flow of silky skin that had once been there. That skin had been hidden from the world for years at a time, revealed only during brief forays to Ember Island, and even then, it had been carefully shielded from direct sunlight. It had been skin worthy of pride, skin worth money, skin that recalled the dead surface of a reflecting pool. Now, it was puckered like the sea, irregular and wavy. What was once silk now had texture. Water splashed against the expanse of skin, and the remaining drops worked their way down in accordance with the call of gravity. The skin's new roughness wasn't enough to push the droplets off course, but it battered at the surface tension of each one, drawing water off each bead the way a battle drew blood from a dying warrior. By the time the drops reached bare hip, they were reduced to almost nothing. Mai sighed. Her failure had resulted in a permanent scar. That was annoying. She bathed daily. The river of choice today was something like almost warm enough, and so couldn't go more than 24 hours without being reminded of Kyoshi Island. Zhao had stumbled upon Mai just as she was finishing her telegraph message to Angela betraying Aang's destination of Crescent Island, and he had looked like he knew, like he had figured out that her true loyalties. Her only choice was to kill him, but that hadn't worked out. Instead, Mai had been set on fire. And then the people she had just betrayed came and rescued her. The scar was an irregular circular patch centered on Mai's right side, over the lower half of her rib cage. Mother would have a fit if she saw, scandalized that her daughter's precious skin had been marked, but Mai wasn't so bothered. Yes, it didn't look great, but it was in a spot that would usually be covered. Anything that bared her stomach would reveal the scar, but it wasn't exactly ugly, and anyone who had a problem with how it looked could just choke on the fact that it was earned in honorable service to the ascendant faction of the royal family. They could also choke on the fact that Mai had been lit on fire and survived to stab again. How many people could say that? As Mai finished her bath and made her way back to where her clothes waited on the bank, she wondered if Zuko's scar was worse than hers. It was on his face, but discoloration and roughness weren't all that bad. It would be an easy thing to get used to, she was sure. And if not, she would get used to it anyway. Scars didn't change who people really were. Mai was still a traitor, and possibly a failure. Once she was dressed, she made her way back to the camp she shared with the boys. She could brush out her wet hair once they were all flying on Appa. According to their maps, there was a fairly large village not far away, sure to have a nice market, and they needed plenty of supplies to get safely them to Crescent Island. Sokka stood in the village of Guwu, in the middle of the main thoroughfare, and looked out at a glorious spread of merchants and goods, harvested from across the Earth Kingdom and representing the finest ways of commerce. All right. How much do we have to spend? On Sokka's left, Mai sighed, and held up a single bag, no bigger than a fist and disturbingly saggy. The whole sum of our spendable assets amount to 1 silverish coin and 3 coppers. On Sokka's right, Aang adjusted the black headscarf he was still borrowing from Mai to cover his arrows. That's not going to take us very far. Maybe we can earn some extra. I'm a pretty good dancer, so if I set up where people can watch me, I can do a jig and let them throw coins at me. Maybe Momo can get in on that. He looked to the lemur, who looked up from licking his own armpit and trilled questioningly. As much fun as that sounds, Mai said, there are quicker ways to get more money. I'm fast with both a knife and my hands. I can just make my way through the crowd there and cut purse strings as I go. You two can tail me and be ready to assist in case I get caught. Sokka had to admit that it sounded a lot more efficient than Aang's suggestion, but the airbender gave voice to the little niggling voice in the back of Sokka's mind when he said, "You want to steal from those people?" Mai shrugged. Sure. We need money. So we'll take it. But these people didn't do anything to deserve getting robbed. So what? We need the money. I'm not really sure why this is hard to understand. Aang was taking a breath for what was no doubt an even louder and less productive counter-argument, so Sokka held up his hands to cut off both sides of the debate, feeling lucky that he happened to be standing in the middle of the two and so was perfectly placed to arbitrate. As much as I enjoy a robust debate about the weight of ethics versus a purely objective-based way of life, it's a little beside the point here. Mai, in case you do mess up, Aang and I might be able to help you get away, but then how are we going to get the supplies we need? We'll have to fly somewhere else, and that will take us further out of our way. There's too much risk. Why don't we start by identifying what we need here, and how much it will cost? Maybe we can bargain a day of work for what we need, or something else equally convenient, and then we don't have to worry about what they do to thieves in this village. He lowered his hands and smiled. Sound good? Aang smiled back and gave a nod. Mai rolled her eyes and gestured her surrender. Sokka had come to quite like shopping. It was fun looking at all the neat things that merchants had up for sale, from weapons to clothes to all kinds of foods. Sokka couldn't even recognize a third of all the fruits that were gathered in baskets in this market, and the smells of various varieties of meat sizzling on grills tantalized his nose with the mysteries of possum chicken and armadillo bear and pig deer and others that Sokka couldn't even begin to imagine. The only thing ruining the whole experience was the prices. That high. Sokka had asked at one point, about a bushel of apples that would keep Appa going for a whole 2 hours. The merchant woman's face grew hard. Can't go any lower. The taxes the Fire Nation just levied. Sokka had nodded and moved on. He met up with Mai a little while later, and they compared totals. It was depressing enough Sokka actually considered taking her up on her purse-snatching skills. After all, though these people were Earth Kingdom, but it's not like they had it as bad as the Water Tribe or prisoners like Katara. Then Aang found them, holding Momo, and was grinning that grin that seemed to be a prelude to either trouble or a discussion about the value of a vegetable-rich diet. Either way, Sokka inched over so that Mai was standing between him and the airbender before he said, "What did you find?" Aang shifted his lemur from one arm to the other. "Well, I was introducing myself to these really friendly ostrich horses at the stables down the road, and I met the guy who owns them, and I got him to give us all a job. For money." "Huh. That wasn't so bad." Sokka stepped out from behind Mai. "How much?" Aang named an amount, and Sokka's heart warmed even further. That would take care of a good chunk of the supplies they wanted, and definitely everything they merely needed. "So what's the work?" "Well, the guy's stables haven't been cleaned out in a while, and he thought that between the three of us Oh, Mai interrupted, "Don't tell me we're mucking out the stalls." "Okay," was Aang's reply. Then he turned back to Sokka and said, "We're mucking out the stalls." Sokka raised his eyebrows at Mai. "He didn't tell you, so you're not allowed to stab him." They dropped Momo off back with Appa, and Mai changed into clothes she wouldn't mind burning later, and then they met up with their employer. Aang felt a little bad for joking with Mai, but as soon as they were alone, he broke out the airbending and used some quick swipes of his staff to whip the hay out of the first stall along with all the mess it contained, and landed it in a nice pile off to the side. "Now we just need to use that rake get the last of the shavings at the bottom." While Sokka did so, Aang turned to Mai. "As soon as he's done, you can bring a bale of hay and fresh shavings over, I'll hurricane it all into place, and this one will be done." That's how they used to do it at the Eastern Air Temple. "We'll be finished in no time. And we're getting paid for the job, not how much time we spend, so." She gave a slow nod. "I have to admit, this isn't so bad. You don't have a problem with getting a day's pay for quick work?" "Well, I'm using my airbending, and that's a rare skill, so I'm only charging a fair price for it, right?" He grinned at her to make sure she was in on the joke and wouldn't consider him a stick in the mud, and then she smiled back, so as far as Aang was concerned, this was now officially the best day ever. They worked steadily after that, and Aang took it as a sign of Mai's good mood that she didn't complain once. In fact, she even initiated some conversation with, "So where are we heading after we're done in this village?" As Sokka raked the next stall clean, he said, "Might as well keep moving east, and we should figure out what point on the coast we're launching from to get to Crescent Island. Do we want to take off from the furthest tip of the Earth Kingdom?" Aang swiped his staff again, calling forth a burst of wind that caught the soiled hay of another stall and sent it flying into the garbage pile on the other side of the stable. A short flight over the ocean would be better for Appa, but I think he'd rather fly for a little longer than have to dodge fireballs and catapults right at the beginning. "Mai, do you know what part of the coast is safest?" Something about his own question tickled at Aang's memory, like he already knew how to find the answer to his own question, but he couldn't guess what it might be. This was his first visit to the Earth Kingdom in 100 years, after all, and Mai was their only expert on the details of the current state of the world. Unfortunately, Mai shrugged. The Fire Nation has bases up the entire coast. The eastern slice was the earliest part of the continent to be colonized, so there's a strong presence there. I guess some areas are safer than others, but that's not really knowledge I have. "Well, so much for our Fire Nation expert," Sokka said. If you weren't such effective muscle, I'd dock your pay. First we'd have to dock your pay, since your attempts at humor are actively impeding this heroic quest. Oh, that's right, we also keep you around to keep my ego in check. It must be nice to be multi-purpose. Aang frowned. Purpose? Why did that sound familiar? As he thought about it, the pieces slowly came together in his thoughts, and he found himself saying, actually, I think I dreamed how to figure this out. Sokka and Mai both stopped to look at him. Aang shrugged back at them. It's weird, but it's like there's directions in my head, and I think I had a conversation about how they'll get me to people who can help us. People who need a purpose. Sokka glanced over at Mai briefly before looking back at Aang and saying slowly, we've all been thinking hard about this, but dreams aren't real, so maybe if we get back on track dash. No, I know how crazy it sounds, but this isn't like a real dream. In my head, look, I know that first we need to go to Ujia province, near Tati City, but I've never even heard of any place called Tati. Mai put down the hay she was carrying and walked slowly over to Aang. Tati City is one of the first 10 colonies. It was nothing more than an Earth Kingdom outpost until the Fire Nation turned it into a major waypoint on the supply chain to the front, during the war. Are you sure you didn't just see that name on one of our maps? Aang shook his head. He had been letting Sokka handle the maps, since he didn't like to see drawings of the Earth Kingdom filled in with red colors. Do you think this could be dash? Mai reached up to smooth one of her hairtails, leaving some bits of hay sticking to it. Could this be from your avatar spirit? Aang considered that. I'm not sure. The avatar spirit is supposed to be the combined power of my past lives, and how would any of them know about Tati? But I'm not really sure how all that works. Aang watched his friend's reactions. Mai's eyes were narrowed, and she brought her sleeves together to hide her hands. Sokka leaned on his rake, rubbing his chin. They were both obviously trying to find an explanation for this, because that's the way they were. They liked to understand everything, even rationalizing their own likes and dislikes. Aang, though, understood that the winds had a will of their own, and that letting them carry you was sometimes the best way to get to your destination. We were just saying that we'd be moving towards the coast anyway, right? We can fly to Tati and see if we can spot anything. And if we do, we can make a decision. Sound good? Mai was the first to surrender. She sighed, brought her hands out of her sleeves, and said, whatever. Sokka took a moment longer. All right, that's reasonable enough. But seriously, if we're letting dreams make our decisions for us now, then we are doing a lot worse than we thought. It was becoming Mai's routine to do her hair during Appa's early morning takeoff. She might be consorting with enemy insurgents, accumulating permanent scars, and peacefully tolerating a winged lemur imitating her routine by stroking its own long ears for minutes at a time, but she'd die before she stopped brushing her hair into a smooth and shining state. She had no idea why, since Mother wasn't around to bug her about looking nice, but it wasn't like she had anything better to do on these long flights. Around mid-morning, they were soaring high above Tati City. The settlement sprawled across the top of a tableland, with a complex system of ramps and rope lifts connecting the plateau to the ground below. The landscape around it was dull green with cranky-looking shrub growth, but the plant life failed to hide the rocky nature of the ground. Mai could only imagine that this area fell to the Fire Nation either through a surge of overwhelming military force, or a sharp lack of local earthbender warriors. Mai looked over at Sokka, who was also gazing down over the edge of the saddle. Hey, camping boy, do you see any spot down there where we can set down out of sight? I see plenty of little rivers, but not enough cover for a sky bison. Sokka shook his head. Nothing anywhere close to Tati. We'd have quite a walk if we need to go to the city itself. Oh, lovely. Walking. My favorite mode of transportation. Sokka smirked at her. You've gotten pretty used to flying, huh? No. Mai turned to look down at the landscape again. I just appreciate its efficiency. Too bad more people in the Fire Nation aren't like you. My dad told me, back when I was really little and we were still living outside the mining settlement, that hunting things to extinction was the most disrespectful act a hunter could do. To kill all the sky bison along with Aang's people is just, well, you know. Mai said nothing to that. Sokka was always blaming the Fire Nation for things, but why not Aang for not being around, or the air nomads for being such pushovers? Mai felt the same kind of frustration when she thought of the Sky Bison or the air nomads as she used to when she saw Azula pushing Zuko around. Why couldn't he just be strong enough not to be victim? Whatever. Mai was tired of flying, now. She turned to where Aang had sitting on Appa's head, with Momo in turn perched on Aang's bald head, to see if he had any opinions about where to land. She found Aang standing, pointing away from Teddy City to where the ground became divided by shorter plateaus into a complex of ravines. Momo had already vacated Aang's cranium, and was quickly scampering over to Sokka with what seemed like disturbed surprise, just like it did whenever Mai startled it by suddenly pulling a blade out of her sleeve. "What?" she said, "are pointing at the way." He blinked, shook his head, and lowered his arm. "Hey, I have more answers in my head." Sokka scooted to the front of the saddle, Momo sheltered in his arms. "That's not usually something that happens automatically. What are your weird non-memories telling you now? To look at that." Aang pointed again, and Mai followed his finger to a specific ravine. She couldn't tell why it was different from the others all around it, but then she noticed the long plateau that formed one of its walls, and realized that it was shaped like an arrow. And that one, too. Aang shifted his pointing, and sure enough, there was another plateau in the same shape, too precise to be natural. But if it had been carved, what was the point? The only reason Mai could see it now was because she was flying above the scenery. From the ground, the shape wouldn't be visible at all. Before she could voice those questions, though, Aang added, "The bones of the earth will show the way." Sokka shook his head. "Okay, this is seriously getting freaky. That sounds like a quote, complete with inappropriate capitalization, but wait a what? And are we sure we should be following this and not running away as fast as we can?" "Well," Mai said, "my curiosity is aroused. I want to see what's at the end of all the arrows. If we find something bad, we can always just run away or stab it, whichever is easier." And so they flew on, guided by a path only they could see. Sometimes, Sokka despaired for the state of modern curiosity. Curiosity about how things worked like weather and steam engines and the Lang Chow effect was fine. That kind of curiosity was what led to science and improvements in technology and an easier way of life for everyone. But curiosity about mysterious arrows leading into the wilderness? Nothing good could come of that. And yet, outvoted by Master Curious the Airbender and Lady Gloomy the chronically bored, Sokka was on his way to having that specific curiosity satisfied whether he wanted it or not. Aang brought Appa lower once they were further away from Teddy City, and they flew on for several leagues more before they ran out of weird plateau arrows. The terrain was mountainous here, and Sokka couldn't make out any shapes in the landscape, aside from one ridge that kind of looked like Gran when she scowled. "So, what now? Does your brain have anything more to say?" Aang looked back at Sokka, but there was no focus to his eyes, and his voice was flat. "Ever falling, ever frothing, the land is sobbing and eyes are watching." The recitation done, Aang continued to stare. Mai said, "Was that a riddle?" "Oh, great." Now Aang was making up riddles. Riddles. "I swear, if we finish out this day by having to defend ourselves from undead monsters again, I'm quitting the team and getting a new crew." Momo escaped his grip, and jumped out of the saddle to fly in pace with Appa. Now what was up with that lemur? Was he as freaked out by all this as Sokka? Mai whirled one of her blades around a finger as she thought. What is ever falling? When things fall, they eventually stop. That's the typical objection to falling. Aang blinked, and seemed to come out of his trance. I don't like the sound of the land sobbing. That's ominous. But kind of poetic. Sokka sat up straighter and looked out over the edge of the saddle again. Now, if he was someone with a poetic soul who hid thoughts in the head of an unsuspecting monk boy, what would he pick out of the landscape as a waypoint? Ah, there it was. Can you bring us lower right about there? Aang looked where Sokka was pointing, and pulled the reins to communicate his intent to Appa. The sky bison spiraled down, and it wasn't long before Sokka could confirm that he had indeed seen what he thought he had seen. There you go, one always falling sobbing land. It was a waterfall, a big one, spraying off of one of the mountains and filling the ravine below with a rushing river. Yeah, that's it. Aang was standing up on Appa's head again, and the sky bison gave a groan of celebration. And the next step is to reverse the running. We should follow the water back up the mountain. Aang guided Appa to swoop over the rapids, chasing them up and around the mountain, while Sokka watched for monsters or ghosts or whatever else might come with mysterious avatar riddles. Momo followed in flight, swooping down to touch the water every so often. At one point, their path brought them past a tall, sheer cliff that loomed over them, and Aang pulled on the reins to signal Appa to slow down. Sokka looked up at the cliff. Let me guess, the next step in our riddle. Aang nodded slowly. Walk the wall. That's all I know. Mai snorted. So much for poetry. I don't have the slightest idea what that means. Walk the wall? Sokka thought about it, but there were no magic answers bursting forward from his mind right now. Where was Aang getting all this? And how did a bunch of plateaus get shaped like arrows? And then Sokka's mind finally found the connection, all on its own, no magic riddles required. Earthbenders. The other two turned to look at him. Mai said, what? We're on some kind of earthbender trail. Who else could have made those arrows? Who else would know those arrows are arrows without a sky bison to fly over? Earthbenders can sense the shape of the arrows, and I bet they'd be able to feel the rapids and waterfall before they even see any water. And who else could walk a wall? Earthbenders can literally just crawl their way up without footholds or equipment, according to the stories I heard when I was a kid. I bet we're supposed to go up. Mai looked at Aang, who shrugged. Sounds possible to me. Appa, yip yip. Appa roared and ascended with heavy flaps of his tail. Momo rejoined the group in the saddle, apparently unable to match a sky bison's ability to gain altitude, and when they all passed the top of the cliff, even more rocky terrain was spread out before them. Sokka, starting to get into this whole riddle-solving thing, said, okay, what next? Know the stranger in the sandstone. Huh. See what I'm talking about? More earthbender talk. Stranger in the sandstone. Now what could that dash? We're looking for something that isn't made of the local sandstone, Mai interrupted. Obviously. Now how are we going to do that without an earthbender? She looked over at Aang, but it was a long moment before she spoke again. Could you with your avatar spirit dash? No, Aang said quickly. I don't think I can. His eyes shifted away from the girl he usually couldn't stop eyeing. Well, okay then. Sokka sat up and looked at the other two. We know we're roughly in the right spot, and a different kind of stone will probably be differently colored, so let's fly around and see what we see. Whoever made that crazy riddle probably wasn't counting on our rather unique point of view, up here. Aang immediately perked up. Worth a try. Come on, Appa, a little higher. He snapped the reins, and a corresponding snap of Appa's tail gave them even more altitude. Sokka moved to one side of the saddle while Mai moved to the other, and they all began their surveillance. It was Aang who eventually spotted the ruined temple with the large onyx statue on its roof. Aang liked the temple. It obviously didn't belong to the air nomads, but it had the same sense of pious grandeur and natural peacefulness as the temples where he had grown up. Standing within the crumbling structure of the main hall, he could see that everything, the thick walls and solid statues and high-domed ceiling and massive columns and complex relief sculptures were all connected, one single piece that rose right out of the ground. It could only be the work of earthbenders, and even if Aang couldn't guess that much, he would have recognized the symbols in the decorations from his visits to Omashu. Badger moles appeared as frequently as sky bison did in the air temples, along with the classical iconography of hardy vines for the life that could survive on even the rockiest terrain, and the imposing figures of the old kings and queens of the First Kingdom. This was a temple of the earth, perhaps visited once upon a time by a past avatar. For all the dust, for all the emptiness and crumbling walls and faded paint, there was a wholesome air to the place completely unlike the taint that had been on the southern air temple. So it turns out that the treasure at the end of the mystery path is an old building full of dust, Mai said. Meh. Aang bit back the cry of disappointment he wanted to release. Couldn't she see what a treasure this place was? Even abandoned, even in its current state of disrepair, this place was a physical expression of centuries of Earth Kingdom belief, of the culture that defined them as a people. Then Aang remembered that Mai was Fire Nation, and even if she was a good person who betrayed her people, she probably still saw things a little oddly. Well, I like it. Sokka was peering at one of the relief carvings, a scene of earthbenders raising a city out the sands of a desert. But I had jerky for lunch and got to solve a riddle, so I might just be in a really good mood. Still, I'm not seeing why it's so important that we come here. Unless there are any more mysterious directions that will guide us to an ancient avatar weapon or something. Aang chuckled. The voices have stopped telling me what to do for now. Maybe this is just a good place to meditate and make peace with the universe before we set off on the final phase of our quest to save Katara. Sokka said, "Way." Mai said, "Ugh." Then the ground rose up and trapped Aang in a column of stone. Mai blinked as the stone slats rose up to seal Aang in a standing position, and before he could even cry out, he was locked immobile in the newest addition to the temple's decor. Before she could blink a second time, she ran through a series of quick thoughts. Enemies. Earthbenders. Knives. Cut people. As soon as a figure dropped down from somewhere on the domed ceiling, Mai had a pair of razor discs in the air, but there was a flash of metal and a clanking sound that she would never enjoy hearing, signifying a successful defense against her blades. Her eyes focused to find a mop-haired man, no, a teenager brandishing a pair of hooked swords and glaring at her. He hissed, "Fire Nation," and dashed at her, raising the swords for chopping attacks. As Mai drew a pair of her longer knives and brought them up to catch and redirect the boy's attack, she gave a quick glance around the rest of the main hall and saw Sokka dancing away from a series of earthen slats that were rising up out of the ground and trying to trap him just like Aang. The airbender himself was still stuck, but he was watching Mai, and as her gaze landed on him, their eyes met, and Aang's eyebrows twitched. Ah! He had a plan. Mai carefully kept her face blank. Her attacker came at her again with his swords, alternating his slashes to try to control the rhythm of the fight, but it was a pattern she had drilled against time and time again, so she knew exactly how to defend herself without putting too much stress on her knives, and when to move to disrupt the rain of blows against her. Mai began circling her opponent as though trying to get around his guard, but he sidestepped in the opposite direction to keep himself facing her. They continued that way, orbiting each other, her attacker probing at her defenses when he could while Mai hovered at the edge of his range, until she finally stopped and lunged forward as if to make a stabbing attack. The boy crossed his swords and caught their knives on the spiked guards of his weapons, and grinned as he pressed back at her. The long blades of his sword swung down so that they were on either side of her head, the hooks hovering at the back of her neck, and he grunted as he pulled away so that he could slide his swords together to meet at her neck. And then a gust of wind no softer than a brick wall slammed into the guy and knocked him clean across hall. Mai turned to where Aang was still trapped, but perfectly positioned to blow an air attack at the exact space that she had tricked the swordsman into occupying. When Aang noticed her looking, he smiled, completely pleased with himself, and she gave him an appreciative salute with both of her knives. Then a new voice rang out with, "Hey, you're an airbender. Does that mean you're the Avatar?" The stone that had been pinning Aang crumbled to pebbles, and he shook himself free of the dust. When he looked up again, he found another teenager, this one long-haired, with a thin mustache and a tuft of beard on his chain, stepping through the doorway of one of the temple hall's side rooms. Aang nodded. "I'm Avatar Aang. And you're an earthbender." "Yes, my name is Haru. I heard the news about what you did on Kyoshi, transforming in a sea monster and running the Fire Nation off the whole island. That's the most amazing thing I ever heard." "What?" "That's what people were saying about him." Aang was still trying to figure out how to reply when Sokka's laugh echoed through the temple. "Ha! And did you hear about how he can transform into a sky bison and carry people all over the world?" Haru's eyes went even wider. "You can." Aang could hear Mai give a snort behind him, but he ignored her and said, "You shouldn't believe everything you hear. I just made friends with a sea monster, and that was only part of an attack on the Fire Nation there, not liberating a whole island." "Oh." Haru's smile didn't go away. "Well, that's still a great story, and I'd love to hear it. But first we should check on Jet. Sorry we attacked you, but this place is supposed to be a secret." "Jet." Aang turned to where the crazy guy with the hook swords was finally easing himself to his feet. "Sorry about that, and, for the confusion, but I couldn't let you hurt my friend Mai. Your friend is a filthy Fire Nation Friday dash. Hey, Mai interrupted, pointing her knives at the boy, you finish saying that word and I'll stick stiletto in your ears. Jet looked like he was going to consider it, but then his eyes went to the knives in Mai's hands and he swallowed his initial reply. You're still Fire Nation. Did you forget to tell your buddy about how your people killed all of his? Aang didn't even realize he was moving until he had stepped between the two. Mai is my friend. What the Fire Nation did has nothing to do with her. Jet held Aang's gaze for a long moment, and then smiled and took a step back. Oh, a defector, eh? Well, I can't argue with the Avatar himself. And who's the Water Tribe guy? Sokka kept all expression from his face as he said, name's Sokka. Southern Tribe. Nice swords. Yeah, I like them. Silence reigned until Haru finally stepped up to break it. So, Avatar Aang, what brings you to our village? Oh, you can just call me Aang. Wait, what village? Wait, what village? One of the columns in the Earth Temple's main halls didn't quite connect with the ceiling. The cause of the breakage was lost to time, but there was a chunk of the column that was missing from the very top, leaving a gap just large enough to accommodate someone in a crouch. An observer sat there now, watching the meeting between the Avatar's companions and the temple's defenders. The spy's gaze rested for a long time on the Avatar himself, taking in the boy's youth and his contrasting poise. Then it moved to Sokka, but the Water Tribe savage radiated nothing but distrust and inadequacy. Finally, the observer's focus moved to Mai. She was Fire Nation to the bone, decked out in red and black and wearing one of that culture's traditional hairstyles, displaying a self-control that silenced all other possible tells. Her face was the crafted blankness of the mistrustful, and her economy of motion was a testament to her readiness to jump back into battle at a moment's notice. Oblivious to being watched, Mai flicked her hands and somehow returned her knives to some hidden access points in her robes, and there was no doubt the weapons could be retrieved again with equal ease and quickness. There was no doubt that this one was dangerous. From beneath a grinning, leering mask of a spirit, a mask rendered in paints of blue and white, the observer started making plans for this Mai of the Fire Nation. Sokka had to admit that what Haru was describing was maybe worth the side-tripping and riddle-solving. A village of fugitives and refugees, hidden in a ravine below this temple. Haru motioned for the group to follow him deeper into the temple. Sokka made sure to bring up the rear, keeping an eye on everyone, especially Jet. Haru, leading the way down halls and through empty rooms, continued, the Fire Nation doesn't tolerate earthbenders. In all the full colonies, anyone caught earthbending, for any reason, is arrested and taken away to one of the special prisons. Some earthbenders hide what they are, but it can be hard. As they all walked, the path grew darker, as they moved away from the windows and crumbling gaps in the ceiling that let in the sunlight. Once bending has been awakened in someone, there's a need. For most of the people who try to hide it, it's just a matter of time before it comes out, one way or another. Sokka noticed that the hall they were taking was sloping downwards. Doing some quick calculations about the angle of descent and the distance the group had walked so far, he concluded that they had passed underground, into the mountains he had been scanning from the sky during the riddle hunt. He hoped that Appa and Momo would be okay outside the temple for a while with no trees for cover. The path grew darker, but there were regular square holes in the walls, just beneath the ceiling, through which shafts of sunlight came down, providing enough light to see by, at least. Haru continued talking. The land around Tati has always favored earthbenders, though, and this temple was maintained by an order of shamans for ages. When the Fire Nation invaded, over 100 years ago, the shamans fled, but only so that their temple would not be found. They kept the memory of it alive amongst themselves in an order of philosophers with which they had maintained friendly relations. And so when earthbenders needed a place to hide from the Fire Nation, a riddle was quietly passed along that would allow them to find this place. Aang nodded. The bones of the earth will show the way from Tati. Ever falling, ever frothing, the land is sobbing and eyes are watching. Reverse the running, walk the wall, and know the stranger in the sandstone. That's the one, Jet said. Where did you hear about it? Sokka rolled his eyes. Would you believe it popped into his head like some kind of dream? Jet turned to look at Sokka, as though expecting a joke. No, I'm not sure I would. Then join the club. We have membership cards. Well, Aang said, I am a monk. Maybe the temple was calling to me. Haru gave a laugh. However you found this place, we're happy to have you. It's an honor to host the Avatar. Sokka could see a light approaching. The hall tunnel thing they were in was curving now, and it seemed like the sun was shining in from just around the bend. So this place is a village of refugees, living in the basement of a temple? Doesn't sound like very nice accommodations. Haru looked back with a smile. You'd be surprised. And who said anything about a basement? The temple is our doorstep. This is our village. He led them out of the tunnel and into the light. Sokka found himself gasping as his eyes adjusted and he saw a wide ravine sprawling out below him. The tunnel had led out to a platform near the top of the ravine, just below a long slanting extension that probably blocked the view of this ravine to anyone who wasn't standing right on the edge. A twisting set of crudely shaped stairs led down from the platform to a real village. It had buildings of 1 and 2 and 3 stories, with lanes running between them and people moving around in ostrich horses pulling carts and all the noise of life rising up. Sokka's eyes rose back up as well, taking in the far side of the ravine, and noticed that the stone wall had been carved with ridges running up its whole length, and on those artificial paths people tended vibrant green plant growth. Sokka realized he was looking at a vertical farm, providing food for the village. He whistled, impressed by the engineering as he spotted the irrigation pipes, and the system of ropes and lifts that allowed equipment to be moved around. Earthbenders raised and lowered massive boulders that were serving as counterweights on the lift systems, but as Sokka examined things closely, he realized that there were more ropes and platforms than seemed to be in service. Actually, now that he looked, he noticed that a fairly complex system of ropes and bridges and perches and ladders extended right out over the village itself, setting up what seemed like an airborne system of roads. Sokka pointed. What are those? Jet smirked as the group started moving down the stairs. It's not all earthbenders around here. People like me don't necessarily enjoy spending their whole lives on the ground, and even barefoot earthbenders sometimes need to take a break from being able to sense everything around them. It's not a big deal for people like me, Haru said. I'm just a novice, so I can't sense anything through the ground unless I really concentrate, and even that doesn't tell me much. But the kinds of earthbenders who are capable of finding the temple are much better at that type of thing, and this ground resonates very well, so it can be a little overpowering until they get used to it. As amazing as it all was, Sokka's feet were plenty tired by the time the group left the stone staircase behind them and reached the floor of the ravine. The sun was fading quickly, the slanting tops of the walls no doubt limiting the duration of the day, and torches began coming to life in the village. Sokka had to admit, it was an even slicker operation than the Kyoshi rebels were running. He hoped it worked out even half as well as his visit to the island had. Mai was getting really tired of all these Earth rebel operations. She wasn't normally claustrophobic, but having tons of solid rock or earth or dirt or whatever looming over her was reaching Agila class levels of intimidating. Haru and Jet had brought the group to the leaders of the village in a town hall of some sorts, which just so happened to be run by Haru's daddy. Speaking of intimidating, the man had a voice that was deeper than the abyss of Jodhpur and a build like a tank that decided to get up and walk, but this tyro nevertheless had the graceful step of a bender and an easy smile on his grey-bearded face as he greeted the group. Avatar Aang, welcome to our little hideaway. It raised our spirits when we first heard the rumors of your return, and having you in our midst is a greater gift than ever hoped for. Let us show our appreciation for the Avatar. The village council, and the audience that had gathered in the hall, all cheered. Aang waved back, the biggest and dumbest grin on his face. Mai stood off to the side with Sokka, and inched closer to him so that he blocked easy view of her. She didn't like the glances her red clothes were getting. The council then called for a festival, and people rushed off to prepare food and instruments while Haru and Sokka went back up to the temple to bring Appa and Momo down into the ravine. Aang remained to tell Tyro and the council the story of his thawing and questing, so Mai decided to make herself scarce. Haru's talk earlier of earthbenders being able to sense everything around them through the ground had her feeling watched, and she decided to see what this stupid village looked like from the rope bridge system above. She walked the streets, shunning the torches that brought light to the early dusk, and eventually found a ladder with no one around it. She climbed up until she reached the perch above. It was simple, a platform made from slats of wood with minimalist railings to prevent missteps, but it was all solid enough and offered a decent view, so Mai gave it a cautious approval. 2 rope bridges extended off from the platform into the darkness, and she decided to go exploring. In the dark, high above everyone else, invisible to all senses, Mai allowed herself a smile as she went running across the rope bridges. The wooden slats swayed under her light steps, but they offered support enough for one of her training. Ty Lee probably would have been able to run across the ropes themselves without a problem, and Mai allowed herself a moment to miss her friend. No one else really understood the joy of this kind of freedom. Mai didn't see her stalker until it was almost too late. The figure was standing at the end of the rope bridge she was traversing, a person made of shadows, except for the single broadsword that reflected the light of the torches below. When Mai saw it, she drew to a stop and pulled a pair of razor discs, not sure if a fight was being offered but definitely not liking a naked blade being brandished in front of her. The figure took a step forward, and some of the torchlight from the village spilled up to reveal the face. Or rather, the mask. It was a classic opera mask, painted blue and white, of a character known to Mai. The Blue Spirit was famous amongst everyone in the Fire Nation and the colonies with even a little culture, a trickster figure in all kinds of stories and plays who always challenged those with power. The Blue Spirit raised its blade to point at Mai, and stepped forward. Beneath her feet, the rope bridge swayed. Chapter 14, The Blue Spirit. It was night in the ravine of the hidden village, but life had not gone away with the sunlight. The whole village had turned out for an impromptu festival, bringing food, and music and dancing and chatter and happy whispers about a boy with arrow tattoos. Ain himself was standing beneath one of the torch poles that was shedding light over the proceedings, gesturing wildly as he finished saying, "And then the riddles in my dream brought us here, and we got into a little fight with Haru and Jet, but no one got hurt. We still aren't sure why I got riddles in my head, though. Your village is really nice and all, but it doesn't seem to have much to do with waterbender prisons." Tyro chuckled, and the deepness of his voice made it seem like the earth itself was rumbling with amusement. It struck Ain was perfectly appropriate that this man would be the head of a hidden earthbender village's ruling council. That's quite a tale, Avatar Ain. And yet still more believable than the rumors my son brings home from his scouting trips to the city. Ain laughed, along with the son in question, Haru. Tyro continued, "I'm afraid I don't know why you would have been led here, but we are honored that your avatar spirit sought us out as allies, and will do our best to help you. But for tonight, relax and enjoy yourself, so that your mind will be ready for the coming battles." That sounded good to Ain. The music shifted to a jaunty tune that he didn't recognize, but he bobbed his head in time with it and grabbed a couple of spiced broccoli twists from a passing tray. This was the only vegetarian party he had ever been to in the Earth Kingdom, since the people in this village were pretty much reliant on what they could grow and raise on their vertical farms. Shelves had been carved into the walls of the massive ravine, and rows of green growth provided various melons and vegetables. Sokka slipped his way through the partying villagers and hopped over to Ain, snagging a broccoli twist on the way. App is all settled by the local stable with some hay, and Momo flew off to explore. He bit into the broccoli, and made a face. Not very satisfying. Anyway, where's Mai? Ain blinked. That's right, he hadn't seen Mai for a while. He had gotten so caught up in the welcoming that he had lost track of her. Not sure. Do you think we should go looking? He imagined her with a twisted ankle somewhere, sobbing and calling out for him to come rescue her and bring her to the dance floor. How she was going to dance with a twisted ankle didn't even worry Ain, they'd figure it out after she was safe again. Sokka shrugged. She's not particularly social. Let her hide if she wants. But what if she's in trouble? Well, she's carrying enough weapons to arm this whole village, and we're in a hidden base of allies in the middle of nowhere. She's probably the safest she's been since she joined up with us. With you, I mean. Ain wasn't so sure about that, but then Haru stepped over with his usual elegant awkwardness, carrying a pair of cups that smelled like what the monks had used to clean bison's knot off walls. Hey, Sokka, right? Want to try some of our beijui? We distill it from the sorghum we grow. Ain frowned. You're supposed to drink that stuff. All the men around here do. Knock it back in one go. Want to try? Aang shook his head quickly, so Haru proceeded to knock back one cup, and afterward gave a sound like a groan. Woo, that's the stuff. Here, show me how the water tribe takes it. Cautiously, Sokka accepted the other cup. All the men. Haru nodded, and Sokka raised the cup to his mouth. Wow, I've worked with metal-eating solvents that don't smell this nasty. I'm curious if it will kill me. Before Aang could ask if Sokka was joking, the older boy swallowed the contents of the cup in one big gulp. Sokka immediately burst out with an exhalation so hoarse that Aang checked the ground to make sure no internal organs had been hacked up. Sokka fell to his knees in a coughing fit, and Aang hurried over to pat his back until he got enough control of himself to squeak, "Tastes like those, Hork. Solvents, too. So, for experimental purposes, am I actually alive? I'd say, KRKRK, I'd say yes, but now I think I'm seeing ghosts flying in the sky over there." Croc. Aang looked where Sokka was pointing, and was surprised to indeed see some arcs of orange light looping over one of the crop ledges up on the ravine wall. "Hey," Haru said, "those are the Changzi lamps. We put them up there because the light keeps bugs away from the crops. Someone must be throwing them around or something." Aang flicked his staff and used a small burst of airbending to deploy the glider wings. He had a bad feeling about this. Mai's fighting style was optimized for distance, and very much dependent on the amount of blade ammunition she had within reach. This suited her just fine, because she liked to keep her distance from other people, and she rarely needed more than 1 or 2 good throws to win. Thus she was mildly annoyed to find herself fighting for her life on a ledge covered in vines and underripe melons, reduced to wielding a cheap metal pole she had yanked out of the ground with an orange paper lantern hanging from one end. The attacker in the blue spirit mask came in again for another assault, stepping easily through the undergrowth and swinging a Deo saber even as he, Mai was pretty confident it was a he, danced around her position. She swung her makeshift fighting staff to deflect the blade, sending the lantern tied to it swinging and jerking with its odd light, but the force of the impact rattled her whole body, and she was slow to bring the long weapon in line again as the blue spirit continued to circle. The blade gleamed in the orange light of the lamp as it came in at Mai, and only the reflexes she had honed in bloody spars with Princess Azula saved her as she dived out of the way. She landed in a roll and tumbled across the melon farm, the loose soil scraping against her face and clothes and hands as she concentrated on keeping a grip on her staff and positioning it so that it wouldn't break her roll. When she came back up, dizzy and filthy, the blue spirit was already rushing at her again, and Mai swung the staff in a desperate attack that wasn't intended so much to actually hit her opponent as simply buy a moment to catch her breath. The fight had started on the network of rope bridges and platform towers that ran over the village at the bottom of the ravine, and when the masked fighter had first appeared, Mai had not lacked in confidence. She started with a pair of razor discs, but the blue spirit had dodged those easily, running across a rope bridge as though it were solid ground. The man behind the mask was fast, almost as fast as Ty Lee had been, and he hadn't found a need to use his saber in any defensive capacity. He had simply stepped or twisted out of the way of all of Mai's attacks, and soon she began to worry about running out of weapons before this fight was over. She had been trying to conserve her supply of blades throughout her whole journey with Aang and Sokka, but she couldn't always recover the knives and bolts she used, and a rope network in the night sky was hardly going to allow her to reclaim anything she used now. So Mai had been forced to keep a long pair of knives in hand, dueling with the blue spirit, but even the acrobatic tricks that Ty Lee had taught her years ago weren't enough to overcome this attacker. The blue spirit fought with not just his saber, but also hands and feet and kicks and punches and shoves and twists and jumps, and it was all Mai could do to keep from being overpowered. By the time she was outright running from her attacker across the rope bridges, she was bruised and sweaty and thinking more about surviving this fight than winning it. Upon reaching one platform, she had turned to cut the bridge behind her, but even that hadn't gotten rid of the blue spirit. He had jumped even as the bridge was starting to fall beneath his feet, and though the leap wasn't enough to take him all the way to Mai's platform, he had grabbed onto the structure of the tower beneath her without even letting go of his saber, and then began crawling up like a spider fly after prey. Mai had been forced to retreat to the vertical farms carved into the ravine walls, running and swinging and even jumping across the bridges and lifts, shooting bolts from her launchers as she went just to give herself the morale boost of having solid ground beneath her boots again. She didn't know why the orange lanterns had been hung on the poles scattered throughout the rows of vegetation, given how deserted the area was at night, but she wasn't going to argue against being able to see the twisting vines and grasses all over the ground. Mai had taken one of the poles as a weapon almost by accident. She had tried to parry a blow from the blue spirit's Deo saber with her knives, but the enemy's blade had been too heavy to withstand, and she wound up both losing the knives and getting a slash across the backs of her hands for her troubles. She had also been knocked back, only staying upright by catching herself on one of the poles, and it had been a simple matter to yank it out of the ground when the next attack had come in and she needed to parry again. She was nevertheless certain she was going to survive this fight. Sure, she suffering from some major disadvantages, but that would only last until she came up with some sufficiently clever tactic that would let her break away. Any second now. Mai brushed her loose hair. At some point it had escaped from its ties out of her face and took up her pole in a two-handed grip. The orange lantern still hung from the left end. The blue spirit came in again, the color of its mask resisting the sickly light, and Mai twisted and jabbed with the end of the pole with the lantern, then withdrew and swung the other end in at her opponent's side, sending the lantern swinging up behind her head like a rising sun. The first jab didn't strike home, but it did stop the blue spirit short, and the next blow was supposed to come in with rib-cracking force, but he leaned into the hit, taking it at an angle against his arm with a sound that sadly didn't include the snap of bone, and then he stabbed forward with his saber. Mai swung her staff up with both hands to catch the blade and deflect it backwards, bouncing the lantern high into the sky, but the move left her completely open, and the blue spirit was already hopping and snapping a foot into her unguarded middle. The boot slammed into her stomach, and while Mai's leaning crouch kept her upright against the blow, that just meant she took the full force of it and a sickly pain exploded in her gut. Mai dropped her staff and dropped to her knees, coughing and wheezing. She could still barely breathe when the Deo blade came swinging down at her head, but she managed to roll to the side through the vines and melons, coming to a haphazard stop right by the edge of the cliff. She gave one last shuddering cough, the sickness in her stomach still radiating through her whole body. She tried to stand, but her muscles wouldn't tighten against the pain. The blue spirit turned without hurry. Whoever he was, he knew the fight was over. Mai glanced behind her at the open ravine, seeing the village and its torches so far below. Then she spotted something else, and finally came up with a clever way to survive. Mai turned to face the blue spirit. Her attacker tensed but didn't raise his blade to a guard position, no doubt confident that even if she threw a knife, it would be easy to dodge. The blue spirit was right about that, at least. So she shifted her crouch to into a spring-loaded squat, and leaped out into the open ravine. She barely had enough time to reconsider the intelligence of the plan when Aang swooped right into her path on his glider and she wrapped her arms desperately around his little body. The falling sensation didn't go away, but then Mai felt a gust of wind hit her like a hurricane, and her stomach flipped and cramped in protest of this treatment so soon after being kicked. She and Aang were rising now, the wind cradling his glider. They swooped over the cliff farm that she had just vacated, and Aang let go of his glider to drop to the vine-covered ground. He set Mai down with more than enough time to catch his looping glider again, shift into a combat crouch, collapse the glider's wings, and angle the staff into a guard position. Unfortunately, the blue spirit wasn't around to see the show. Mai threw glances back and forth, trying to find where the next attack would be coming from, but the enemy was nowhere to be seen. Just like in the stories, the blue spirit had vanished into thin air. Not that she thought there was anything supernatural about her masked attacker, but she had to give up her search when her stomach flipped again and a burst of vomit pushed its way up her throat. She threw up on the ground and gagged. Mai. Grab my hair, she hissed as her stomach gave another clench, but Aang was able to pull her mane out of the way before she threw up again. What a night. Aang was still holding Mai's hair when the others arrived. Tyro and Haru led the way, with Sokka and a group of the other villagers following and looking ready for a fight. There didn't seem to be any fight to be had, though. The vines and melons in the area were all trampled, and a few of the lamps were knocked over. Mai was clearly the worse for wear, even though she had stopped puking, and she wouldn't have jumped off the cliff just for the fun of it. Yet all was quiet here. The others gathered around, and Aang crouched at Mai's side. Are you ready to tell us what happened? She swallowed. I was attacked. A swordsman in a blue spirit mask. She slowly recounted how she had been exploring the sky paths above the village when she was ambushed, and how the fight had carried over to the vertical farm. Jet stepped out of the crowd of villagers. Did you have to bring the fight up here? Look at this place. He kicked the remnants of a smashed melon. We depend on this food to survive. Because the Fire Nation took our homes. Mai turned an acidic glare on him. Next time I'm fighting for my life, I'll be more careful. That's enough, Tyro said. He spoke with a clear sound of authority, but there was no shout or harshness to it. We need to focus on the more immediate danger. It seems that the Avatar and his friends aren't our only guests, and our location might be compromised. Aang stood up. Respectfully, sir, that's not the only possibility. When we arrived, we were flying pretty high up. Only another sky bison could follow us, and we didn't see anyone down on the ground anywhere near here. This blue spirit guy might be someone who already lives here. No way, Haru said. Why would anyone want to attack Dash? He looked at Mai, in her red clothes that were like blood in the light of the orange lanterns, and abruptly stopped talking. Yeah, maybe it's possible. Tyro bowed to Aang. Avatar, as much as we would enjoy having you as our guest for however long you would like to stay, your group is obviously in danger, one way or another. I think it would be best if you leave tomorrow. Aang held back a sigh. He would have loved to stay a while, but he knew Tyro was right, and besides, the longer they waited, the longer it would be before Sokka could finally free his sister. I understand. Thank you for what you've been able to share with us, and we're sorry for any trouble. Now, hold on. Tyro smiled. We're not just kicking you out. You told me that getting to this Crescent Island is going to be tough, and just because you can't stay for now doesn't mean we can't help. We're not entirely self-sufficient here. We still have to do some trading to get necessary supplies, and adding a little variety to our food helps ease the isolation. Sokka scratched at his hair. But the closest city is Tati, and that's wait. He held up a finger, and a smirk grew up on his face. You can't go to Tati because people might become curious where your traders are coming from. So you need some other way of buying and selling. Tyro nodded, and turned to Jet. It was your idea. Tell them. Aang swung his gaze over to the mop-headed teenager. He was the one who came up with this plan. Aang had gotten the feeling that Jet didn't really like them or, more specifically, Mai and anyone who claimed to be her friend and wouldn't have expected him to be the source of any plans. Jet, for his part, gave a lazy smile. We're going to get you to Crescent Island by special delivery. He glanced at Mai. Provided that there are no complications. They set off the next day. Sokka had to drag himself out of bed at sunrise, which was extra tragic this time because he had been sleeping in an actual bed, rather than just a bag on the ground, even if he was bunking in a stranger's house. As he got himself ready for the journey ahead, he worked on a number of grouchy but no doubt amusing complaints that he would deliver to his friends about the inconvenience of the situation. He arrived at the gathering point at the edge of the village ready to let loose with his first gripe, but then he laid eyes on Mai and his words died on his lips. She was, of course, blank-faced and perfectly groomed, but there was a weariness to her eyes that made Sokka feel wide awake in comparison. Aang came over, and judging from the expression on his face, he was seeing the same thing as Sokka. A quick trade of glances was all that was required to reach the consensus that Sokka would speak first. Mai, are you okay? She sighed. I'm still pretty sore, and I slept lightly. Turns out there's no real way to lock the doors around here. Sokka considered that. You think this blue spirit is the real deal? Not in the sense of being a spirit, no. I heard him grunting as we fought, just like any other man. But someone who can fight that well is definitely the real deal in my book. Aang glanced around to make sure that no one else was listening to them, and Sokka confirmed that Haru and Jet were briefing the crew they'd be taking along, while Tyro and the other villagers seeing them off were too far away to hear soft words. Aang said, and you're a weapon of the Fire Nation. What does that make this guy? Sokka had never been quite clear on this weapon business, except that it meant Mai was a big deal to some people, but she and Aang seemed to share an understanding since she replied, he's smart, strategic, and good enough to be scary. He can keep this stupid village if he likes it so much, with my compliments. All right, we're set. Haru stepped over with a bright smile beneath his mustache. Good morning, everyone. Are you ready to go? It finally struck Sokka that within 24 hours, he might finally be seeing his sister for the first time in forever. Of course, he might also be dead within 24 hours, which was the more likely possibility, so he couldn't get too happy. Ready to go and ready to fly. Aang. App is ready. Let's get aboard. Aang did one of his airbending powered jumps that landed him right on the Sky Bison's head, while everyone else climbed up the tail. It was tight in the saddle with everyone a pair of big men named Chong and Wang with arms as thick as Sokka's whole body, a boy called Smellerbee carrying 3 short swords, a woman named Duizhang Hang who had been scowling ever since she laid eyes on Appa, and some other villagers a little older than Sokka who were excited and chatty, and there was a bit of maneuvering as each person found a spot to their liking. As they were all settling into their places in the saddle, Sokka noticed Jet and Mai near each other. Jet gave her a pat on the top of her hair and said, "You're looking beautiful today, my lady." She yanked her head away. "Don't." Jet smirked, and Mai maneuvered over to sit near Sokka. He lowered his overall opinion of Jet, but then wondered about all the times he had teased Mai about camping, bathrooms, shiny hair, and her habit of snorting when unimpressed. But she hadn't actually said, "Don't," to him at any point, so he figured she knew that he didn't really mean any harm. Then came Aang's call of, "Appa, yip yip," and they were all suddenly airborne. The flight took an hour. Mai curled up and went to sleep almost right away, and Momo settled in beside her to share her nap, so Sokka chatted quietly with Haru and some of the younger guys for a while, asking questions about the tools and processes the hidden village used to maximize its resources, and was even able to offer a few mechanical tips for keeping their lift system in good repair. They claimed to have no access to liquid blubber as a lubricant, but promised to look into it. Appa flew over mountains and hills, rocks and sands, forests and brambles. Eventually the earth on the horizon gave way to the blue stretch of the ocean, and soon after, Haru was directing Aang to bring Appa down towards a bay on the coast formed by a ring of hills, capped by a small stretch of sand at the far end with a small stockhouse standing on it. Beached near that was a long boat built like a brick. As Appa came in for a landing, Sokka could see that the ship had a paddle wheel on the side and a metal smokestack at the stern, so it wasn't dependent on the sails, but it had 2 masts regardless. "There she is," Haru announced. "Our smuggling ship. It takes about a day of travel to bring our stuff here, and then we sail around to some port or another to sell and trade. It's a slow process, but it keeps the Fire Nation from tracking us." Sokka looked over the long tub of a ship. "And that thing can get us to Crescent Island?" Haru nodded. "We'll be passing through the Crucible Sea." He reached into his backpack and produced a map. He pointed to the tail end of the Fire Nation Islands, and then to a tangential circle of ocean formed by the curve of the Earth Kingdom continent. The Crucible is the sea between the closest points of the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. That one spot of ocean is actually where most of the naval battles of the last 100 years took place, since it's so heavily traveled. We'd have a hard time sailing from the southern islands to the Fire Nation, for example, since there's a wide open ocean between them, but this ship can get us across the Crucible. Provided there are no storms, of course. Of course. Sokka and Haru hopped down to the sandy ground. "And I'm sure the weather will be nice, pirates will leave us alone, and the Fire Navy won't just decide to sink us for the sheer hilarity of human suffering, but before we can enjoy any of those lucky breaks, we need to make sure Appa will fit into that tub's smuggling compartment." "Hey, how do you know we call her the tub?" "I know everything. Come on, let's get to work." It took everyone to get the ship ready to set sail. A good portion of the main deck was actually a long pair of doors that could be opened to expose the main cargo bay, and since they wouldn't need for much in the way of supplies for this mission, aside from coal for the engine which would be in another compartment, it was decided that Appa could bunk down there. Once the ship was ready to go, the whole crew plus Appa and even Momo assembled on the beach to push the ship out into deep water. Soon after, they were sailing the tub on the ocean waves. As the ship passed out of the bay, Sokka stood out at the prow of the ship, looking at the ocean sparkling in the sunlight, and grinned. They were on the last leg of their journey to Katara, trusting in the waters to carry them, and while he knew that sailing could be dangerous business, he couldn't help but feel that it was appropriate that the mission to save the last waterbender was beginning with a sea voyage. And it was all thanks to Aang. Sokka couldn't have started on this path without the last airbender, and only the Avatar could have commanded the support that had allowed them to come to this point. People wanted to help the Avatar just because he was the Avatar. That he was a good friend like Aang just meant that the universe wasn't completely awful. And when Sokka took Katara back to find Gran, Aang would be okay on his own. Mai would probably even stick around to watch over him, so there wouldn't be any need for more than the usual amounts of worry. When Mai had agreed to this plan, she had forgotten her unfortunate tendency to become seasick when actually on the sea. All that discomfort with flying had completely pushed it out of her mind. The seasickness hadn't started right away. The tub had sailed on through most of the afternoon, and Mai ascribed her mild discomfort to the beating she had taken the previous night. It wasn't until the sun was dipping low that she realized she was feeling even worse than before, and the nausea hit her not long after that. The one positive thing was that no one on the crew wanted to deal with a groaning, sweating, nauseous Fire Nation native, so Mai was left alone to clutch the bulwark and wallow in her misery as the sun set. She wasn't quite at the point yet where she was throwing up over the side, but that rosy future seemed inevitable, and her only consolation was that she would be able to do it in solitary peace. That relative bliss came to an end when Aang ambled over and said, "Are you okay?" Mai turned to look at him. "Am I green?" "Kind of, yeah." Question answered, then. "Oh, sorry." Aang didn't seem to take the hint, leaning against the bulwark and obviously choking on his inability to come up with something intelligent to say. Momo scurried over across the railing, but Aang shooed him away. "Not now, Momo. Mai's not feeling well." The lemur gave a trill and flapped away to bother someone else. Mai swallowed with some difficulty. She was reminded unpleasantly of the previous night, when she was dependent on Aang to help her deal with her own vomiting. He hadn't made a big deal out of it, hadn't so much as mentioned it since then, but the thought of being that helpless and dependent on the kid made Mai want to commit ritual suicide. If all went to plan, Zuko would be waiting on Crescent Island right now, and then it would all be over. Look dash. Hey, Haru said they're going to be turning on the boiler for the paddle soon, he interrupted, and I was thinking that maybe if you went below deck and hung out near the engine, the noise and vibration might be like one of the metal Fire Nation ships and make you feel better. He clasped his hands behind his back, and poked the deck with the toe of his boot. It's just something I thought. I don't know if it makes any sense. Mai blinked. Actually, it does. The running of the engine always helped during the trip to the South Pole. She pushed herself off the bulwark, and had to fight for a moment to maintain her balance. Consider your existence justified for the day. Do you need any help? Mai waved him off, and slowly made her way inside to her cabin. The closets that passed as living quarters on the tub were all grouped at the ship's aft, since the cargo bays took up the whole front of the ship, minus all those weird places like bilges that Mai didn't want to know about. She had to take a flight of stairs down, which was no fun in her current state. She went directly to her own quarters, deep enough that she should feel the engines thrumming as soon as it got going, and opened the door to the small space to find the Blue Spirit hunched over her case of knives. Wait, what? It was the same leering, grinning, blue mask from the night before. The Blue Spirit looked up at Mai's entrance, and she saw that he had something in his hands. It glinted like metal, which wasn't surprising considering that her luggage was full of throwing blades, but she caught a gold twinkle to the shine, and suddenly it was very hard to breathe. It was her encryption cog, the little gear issued by Azula and used to sell Aang out back in the South Pole, over a month ago. Only the most loyal servants of the royal fire family had such cogs. And the Blue Spirit was holding Mai's right now. Her hands were going for her weapons even as the masked figure was dashing forward. He shoved past her with stiff arm to her shoulder that rocked her back into the passageway. The ship lurched before she got her balance, and she found herself twisting to the floor, while the Blue Spirit ran away and up the staircase. Mai tried to push herself back up, but the nausea welled up within her again, and it was all she could do to lie on the floor and keep from making a mess all over herself. The floor seemed to shudder beneath Mai, and at first she didn't realize that it was the coal engine at work. The grim expressions that Aang found facing him immediately ruined his good mood. He had been in the cargo bay with Appa, soothing his friend about having to stay below decks. "Sorry, buddy," he had said, "but Haru warned that patrols might see us before we see them, and if they see you, well, we don't want them to see you, so you have to stay hidden, okay? It's better than being seasick like right?" Appa's answering groan hadn't been too annoyed, but that might have to do with the apples Aang was giving him. When he turned around to get more apples from the sack, he found Sokka, Haru, Jet, and the swordswoman Smellerbee approaching. They came in through the door at the far end leading to the crew quarters and engine room, clustered together like they were expecting an attack, and their faces spoke of a major problem. "What's going on, guys?" Jet turned to the swordswoman, Smellerbee, and she handed him something that gleamed gold in the light of the lamps. "This was rolled into the engine room while we were shoveling coal." He held it up, and Aang recognized it as some kind of mechanical part. "We haven't told the rest of the crew yet, since I wanted your permission to deal with it. It's a gear." Haru crossed his arms over his chest. "It's an encryption cog. The Fire Nation military uses them to translate their messages into unreadable code." Aang frowned. He wasn't quite sure how that worked, but he understood that the Fire Nation origins were the important part. "Are you sure?" Sokka nodded. "I used to see them at the South Pole. The lab had its own set it would use to transmit news, sometimes. But those were all standard steel. I've never seen one made of gold before. And yes, that's real gold." Jet stepped forward, and thrust the cog right into Aang's face. "The Fire Nation only lets its nobles use gold. And the only people allowed to put the flame sigil itself into gold are the family of the Fire Lord himself." He flipped the cog, revealing an etching of the triple-pronged symbol that Aang had quickly come to dread. A chill brushed his heart at the sight, but that didn't mean he understood. "So, why do we have it? Where did it come from?" Sokka looked away. Jet, on the other hand, took another step forward, putting him uncomfortably close to Aang. "It wasn't on the ship before today. We've taken the tub on supply runs plenty of times. But this is the first time we've sailed with a Fire Nation freighter aboard." The wording was confusing enough that it took Aang a moment to figure out who Jet was talking about. "Wait, you think this is Mai's?" "I guess, no, that's not right. I met her family, and they're not royal, just the usual nobility. You must be wrong about the etching." "He's not, Aang." Sokka still refused to look up. "I never actually saw anything like that, but I heard the same thing Jet did. Gold is for nobility, but the flame sigil can't be on it. One of the tests we had for identifying gold was developed 1,000 years ago or something to prove a traitor had been putting the flames on his gold ornaments." His feet shuffled loudly on the cargo bay floor. "They made me learn stuff like that." Aang sighed. "All right, but so what? Mai was given this title, a weapon of the Fire Nation. That means she's a warrior who's so good that the royal family makes them their servant. She probably got this as part of that." Sokka finally looked up. "I've been wondering about that. She's mentioned the title a few times, but not what it means. Where did you hear about it?" Aang opened his mouth to answer, but found himself with nothing to say. How did he learn that? He had been wondering just like Sokka, ever since her quick explanation of how she broke him out the South Pole prison, but now all of a sudden he just knew the full history. I'm not sure." Haru brightened. "Maybe your avatar powers plucked the information from Mai's mind." Aang resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "Yeah, if I could read her mind, I wouldn't be looking for what the whole weapon thing was about." He suddenly realized how that might sound, and quickly added, amidst an embarrassing heating of his cheeks, "It's just really hard to know what she's thinking is what I mean, and that's all." Jet finally stepped away, meeting everyone else's eyes. "I want to know why she was still carrying this thing around, if she's a defector, and why she didn't even tell the Avatar about it. Is she using it to communicate with her secret masters?" "No." Now Aang was the one stepping right in Jet's face, and he didn't even remember making the decision to so. Smellerbee put a hand on his chest to make him back up, but Aang shook her grip off. "Instead of standing around and accusing her of awful things, maybe we should actually go ask her ourselves and treat her with respect." "I like that option." Everyone turned around to find Mai leaning in the doorframe leading to the crew quarters. She didn't look quite as green as before, but her normally immaculate hair was pulled from its buns in places, and her robes were covered in more dust than she ever tolerated. Jet marched right over to her, but Aang was right at his heels and ready to act if the older boy got too pushy or touchy or jerky. Jet thrust the cog out in what was becoming a practiced manner and said, "Explain this. Who were you communicating with?" "My side." "No one." "Then why do you have it?" "That was equipment I was given when my family was sent to the South Pole." "You've obviously figured out what it is." "I thought it might be useful one day, and since it's so small, I brought it along." Aang nodded, completely satisfied, as he had expected to be. Mai was really smart like that, planning ahead for unforeseen trouble. Jet, however, was no friendlier even as he lowered the cog. "And how do you explain it being a symbol of the royal family?" "Well, Aang's explanation is actually the right one, but I'll go one better." A hint of a smirk touched Mai's sweat-streaked face, but it looked forced to Aang's eyes. "I was betrothed to the third in line for the throne, the Fire Lord's grandson." Jet blinked. Sokka said, "Huh." Smellerby hands went to handles of her swords. Haru's eyes went wide. Aang felt like the entire world had been shattered into little pieces of glass, and then quickly glued back together in a horrid attempt to recreate what had once been whole. Mai was betrothed. To a guy who would someday be the Fire Lord. Betrothed. Sokka's snort broke the silence. "So when's the wedding?" Mai rolled her eyes, but then gave a little groan and clutched the doorway. "There's no wedding. I was betrothed. I mean I used to be betrothed. It was broken off years ago. Finding out that I wouldn't be forced at Flame Point to marry someone twice my age was the happiest moment of my life." All at once, Aang could breathe again. "So there's nothing to worry about." Jet frowned, and tossed the golden cog up like a ball, catching it again and tucking it into his belt. "Maybe, but I'm going to hold on to this for a while. Just to be sure." "Oh, right, that matter." Well, there was nothing to worry about there, too. After a greenish glare, Mai stumbled off back to her cabin, and the crowd broke up. Sokka stayed for a moment and watched Mai depart down the hall, but Aang gently grabbed the older boy's shoulder. "She doesn't like people seeing her when she's sick. We just have to let her be by herself." "Yeah," Sokka mumbled, still staring. "Okay." By lunchtime the next day, Mai hadn't made another appearance, but Sokka had dropped by her cabin at one point in the morning, and she had groaned miserably in the answer to his knocking, so he figured she was more or less alive. It wasn't that Sokka really believed that stuff Jet was saying, but something about her never even mentioning the cog didn't sit well with him. He didn't want to fight with her about it, not in front of Jet or someone like Smellerby who would report everything, but he couldn't help but think that an official Fire Nation encryption cog would have been of some use back on Kyoshi Island. They had found a plan that had worked without it, but those weeks spent coming up with the raid on the prison records would logically have been where its existence would have been revealed, and the cog's use debated and possibly ruled out. Unless the cog's encryption scheme had narrow use, or it was unique enough that everyone would know any messages coded by it had been sent by Mai, but if that was the case, why bring the thing at all? Sokka didn't like questions he wasn't allowed to ask, and the fact that he was the one not allowing himself to ask them just made the whole situation more uncomfortable. Good thing he had dangerous Fire Navy patrols to take his mind off of things. Not really. Haru had spotted the smoke of the first patrol ship that morning with a spyglass, and had steered the tub away without being spotted in turn. They had turned off the engine after that, letting the sails and the wind carry the ship along for more stealth. They had evaded a second ship much the same way, but then as they pressed onward to Crescent Island, they came across a black line on the horizon that proved a full blockade. Sailing around it had quickly proved not to be an option as the afternoon whiled away, and then they must have been spotted, as one of the ships fired a yellow signal flare into the sky that was an order to stop for inspection. Standing next to Haru at the wheel, Sokka asked, "Is this the part where we put the engine on maximum boil and have a thrilling chase?" Haru sighed. "No, this is the part where we try to talk them out of searching the ship when they come aboard." "Oh. I hate thrilling chases, but I don't think bluffing Navy captains is actually any better." "It isn't, but at least it's quicker." "True. I'll go tell all the Fire Nation defectors and arrowheads to get out of sight, then. Haru nodded. And I'll give stern lectures to the crazy crew members about making trouble while we have Fire Nation soldiers aboard. Good idea. Sokka went over to the first of the masts, took the hammer that was hanging from a nail by a string, and started hitting the heavy metal bowl that had been bolted to the timber. It was a poor-sounding gong, but it was loud, and it could be heard everywhere but the engine room. After some banging, Sokka went to spread the word more directly. Mai was lying on the shelf that was supposed to be her cot when she heard the clanging of the warning gong. Great, in addition to seasickness, now she had to deal with infiltrators or boarders or whatever they were called. She groaned, pushed herself up, and reached for her luggage. When Aang heard the gong, he immediately went to look for Momo. He couldn't fly, not with the Fire Nation ship bearing down on the tub, but a little airbending imparted some extra speed and balanced him as he ran along the rail of the ship to dive headfirst straight down the stairway. He passed by Mai's cabin, and then quickly reversed and poked his head into the little room. Mai was latching her knife case closed, but stopped, and groaned and clutched her head. Aang said, "Do you want help? I need to find Momo and get to Appa in the cargo hold, but dash." Mai gave a little shake of her head. "Get going. I'll be along." Aang hesitated a moment, and then ran off. Mai wasn't sure how long it took her to finish packing up, but Aang was nowhere in sight when she emerged from her cabin. She wanted to hurry down the passage to the cargo bay, but without the engines running, her nausea was difficult to fight, and sudden movements weren't advisable if she didn't want Fire Navy soldiers asking who had been throwing up below decks. She still hadn't made it far when she heard the distinct sound of Fire Navy engines rumbling through the tub's hull. They were here. Commander Zhao couldn't say he thought much of the ramshackle tub of a ship, and when he boarded for the inspection, he found that he didn't think much of the crew, either. Green was the most common color in their clothes, but most of them seemed to be wearing cast-offs that had been sewn into something wearable. Zhao didn't much like the self-professed Captain Haru's mustache, either. "Where are you bound for?" Captain Haru bobbed his head. "Shujing, Commander. We've been contracted to go there to pick up a cargo of manufactured goods, to bring back to the colonies." "And what are you currently carrying?" "Nothing, Commander. Just supplies." "Nothing." Zhao turned and looked out over the deck. It was a ramshackle tub, certainly, but something like this could certainly be carrying the Avatar. After all, humble disguises were always the most effective, and the traitor Suki was certain that the Avatar was trying to get to Crescent Island. How does a cargo ship come to be sailing empty all the way across the Crucible? Surely you could have bought something to sell at a profit at Shujing. Captain Haru licked his lips. "We were in a hurry, sir, and funds were low. We couldn't put together a cargo in time if we're going to make our rendezvous. And speaking of, we're already running fairly late, so dash. So you'd appreciate it if you were allowed to go on your way." Zhao made a show of shaking his head. He had already decided on searching the whole ship, but said, "For your impertinence, I think a full inspection is in order. Have your crew unlock everything, and then assemble them all on the main deck. My soldiers will search as quickly as they can, but they do have to be thorough, yes." Captain Haru swallowed loudly. Zhao had to find his entertainment, after all, when on boring blockade duties. Mai was almost to the cargo bay. She heard the heavy steps of Fire Nation boots on the deck above, and tried to make herself hurry, but the ship was bobbing in the water with extra unpleasantness now that it wasn't moving, and sometimes the walls were almost like they were spinning, and sometimes they grinned at her with a fangs and sickly blue coloration. Mai thought she was hallucinating when she bumped into a solid mail chest, but then she realized the blue spirit was standing right in front of her, blocking her way. Chapter 15, The Crucible. It turned out that there were few things as uncomfortable as having a 12-year-old airbender pressed against one's side, a flying lemur wrapped around one's neck, and an agitated 10-ton sky bison taking up all the free space in the same cargo bay where one happened to be hiding from evil Fire Nation hunters. And yet Sokka felt a certain dread, as he listened to the echoes of soldier boots marching across the tub's main deck, that he would soon be discovering just how much more uncomfortable life could be. It was just as well that Mai wasn't here. She hated touching animals and other people. Of course, if she hadn't found a hiding spot yet, that could be its own set of problems. Mai hated a lot of things, but she was starting to find a special place of complete and utter loathing in her heart for the masked troublemaker in the blue spirit mask. He was standing in the hallway of the tub's lower decks as if he owned the ship, tall and solid and carrying his Deo broadsword, blocking Mai's path to the cargo bay. If the blue spirit was looking for a fight, that was bad enough, because Mai didn't think she could beat him even under the best of circumstances, never mind when she was tired and sore and seasick, but now he had chosen to confront her while the tub was being boarded by the Fire Navy. Even if she survived the fight, she had no doubts that the Fire Nation's soldiers would recognize her and arrest her for treason against the homeland. She hadn't even really committed treason. Yes, it was safe to say that Mai really hated her current situation. The blue spirit raised his sword, and all Mai could do in response was groan nauseously and sink to the floor. Commander Zhao, designated hunter of the Avatar, scion of his family, and rising star in the Fire Navy, stood on the deck of an Earth Kingdom scow and hoped that there was nothing aboard that would mess his polished armor. "You five," he said to one line of the soldiers he had brought over from his command ship, "shall search the crew quarters and engine room. The rest of us," he turned to face the other 8 soldiers, "shall accompany Captain Haru to the cargo bay to verify that he did indeed set sail without any worthwhile cargo." With that, he turned on his heel and faced the youthful captain with the desperate mustache. "After you, of course." Captain Haru led the way down the stairs from the deck to the ship's interior. At the first fork in the path, Zhao let the smaller group of soldiers proceed to the engine room, and then continued on to the cargo bay. He couldn't help but notice that this Haru was walking fairly slowly, almost hesitantly. Well, that was interesting. Zhao wondered, with some eagerness, what he would find in the cargo bay. Mai might not have had the strength or balance to fight the blue spirit, but her seasickness hadn't yet taken away her will to live, so as the blade of the Deo saber reached its highest point before the plunge that would take it to her flesh, she leaned forward, pulled a single blade out of her sleeve, and stabbed it down at her attacker's foot. Even here, in this cramped corridor on a run-down cargo ship out to sea, the blue spirit was fast. He yanked his foot back as soon as Mai moved, but she was close enough that her own diminished speed was no real impediment, and so while he avoided having a sliver of sharp metal jammed into his flesh, he wasn't quite able to move his entire boot out of the way. Mai's blade sank into the heavy material, through the empty space in the toe of the boot, and on into the sole, lodging solidly into the floorboards. Then Mai threw herself backwards and began crawling away as fast as she could. She didn't turn around to look. She heard the blue spirit move, heard the whistle of his sword through the air, heard a grunt of surprise and the sound of a body striking the floor and the clatter of a metal blade dropped haphazardly against wood. And that was why people shouldn't leap at their victims while their shoes were nailed to the floor. Mai's stomach roiled at all the stress and motion of her escape, but she was able to smile through it. It was as true today as it was the day Angela first whispered the advice into her ear: if you can't kill your opponent, the next best thing is to trip him. Mai stopped briefly to throw up, and then continued crawling her way to the engine room. Captain Haru reached to open the door to the cargo bay, but Zhao blocked him. "Not yet. Soldiers, get into attack position. We're going to storm this compartment, and anyone inside is to be considered a deadly enemy." All 8 soldiers efficiently arranged themselves into a staggered line. The hallway was too small for them to stand side by side, but by lining up shoulder to shoulder rather than in a straight line, each soldier would be able to more quickly pass through the doorway and clear the line of fire for the person behind him. The skull-like faceplates covered the soldiers' expressions, and Zhao wondered briefly if any of them were hiding nervous looks. After all, it might be the Avatar ready and waiting for them in the cargo bay. Zhao kicked open the door and shoved Captain Haru through it first. Lieutenant Shi was given orders directly by Commander Zhao to investigate any oddities on the Earth Kingdom ship, which naturally would have included any suspicious cargo or people. The problem was that he had no idea what to do with an empty boot that had been nailed to the floor with a small fighting blade, a short distance from a puddle of stomach fluids. While his subordinates waited, Shi prodded the boot with the tip of his sword. It didn't explode, or wiggle, or do anything unexpected of a nailed-down boot. While Shi was grateful that he hadn't stumbled on the world's oddest-looking bomb, he was also a bit vexed that the only thing suspicious about the whole affair was the presence of the boot itself. "Obviously," he said to other 3 soldiers under his command, "it's some kind of prank by one of the crew members. Let's move on to the engine room." No one objected, and Shi was quite grateful. He wasn't really cut out for solving puzzles like that. Something in which he felt more confident about his ability to handle was the sound of a person moving in one of the crew quarters. She kicked in the door to find a mop-headed young man, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, lying in a hammock in nothing but a pair of shorts. The young man said, "Wah! On your feet." She raised his sword. "Why didn't you assemble on the main deck with the rest of the crew?" "Wah!" The young man pushed himself out of the hammock and blinked in slow repetition. "When did you guys get here?" He yawned. She snarled and grabbed the possibly hungover crew member's arm. "Get up to the main deck. This is an official Fire Navy inspection, and I won't tolerate any interference." To his credit, the young man rubbed the sleep from his eyes and ran off back toward the stairs. Now, onto the engine room. As Zhao watched, Captain Haru tumbled into the empty cargo bay to land flat on his face. Zhao had spent years of his life aboard ships of varying kinds, and so when he heard the thump echo through the compartment, he knew right away that it was empty. A full bay wouldn't have reflected the sound like that. He peeked his head through the doorway, and confirmed that cargo bay was nothing but a wide open space with some small supply cases lashed against one wall. Old hay was scattered all over the floor. No avatar, no cargo. Zhao waved the rest of his soldiers into the compartment. "Check those cases and make sure there's nothing suspicious." He sniffed the air, and turned to where Captain Haru was picking himself off the floor. "Why does it smell like animal in here?" "Our last cargo was a herd of ostrich horses," Haru said, brushing himself off. "Didn't have time to give it a full scrubbing, so it still stinks a little." Humph. Zhao watched his soldiers poke around the mostly empty compartment, obviously trying to look busy in spite of not actually having much to investigate, and privately conceded that the ship and its crew were probably exactly what they appeared to be. Unless something was found in the engine room. Below the cargo bay, in the second cargo compartment, Sokka held his breath and listened to the sounds of heavy soldier boots coming through the ceiling above him. Behind him, Appa shifted slightly, but before he could move around much more or actually produce a sound, Aang was petting the sky bison's head and whispering something that sounded like it could be soothing. It must have been soothing enough, because Appa stilled. The sounds of the boots receded. The soldiers must have been leaving. Sokka exhaled not too loudly in relief. If they had moved the hay on the floor, they might have seen the cracks in the trapdoor that led to the smuggling compartment. If they had ripped down the cases with the crew's supply of food in them, they might have seen the switch and mechanisms that opened the floor doors. Sokka hated it when scenarios started with if. Hopefully, this one would be over soon. Engine rooms had lots of hiding places, but Mai had found that a limited number of them were accessible to someone with a cramping stomach who couldn't stand up straight or jump worth a candle. That number, it turned out, was exactly 1. And so it was that she had been forced to dig her way into the big coal hopper and cover herself with sooty, filthy, black lumps of rock. The one consolation was that the earthy smell of the coal, a dead scent that reminded her of Fire Nation warships and even the factories of the homeland, seemed to be helping her seasickness a little. Or else that was just sheer terror that at any moment, a firebender, or blue spirit or someone would grab her by the hair and kill her. She clutched a knife, and was making a vow that she would take her attacker down with her even as the first soldier was saying, "All clear." Zhao sighed. He had only been able to stretch the inspection out to an hour, on a ramshackle ship this size, and so his entertainment had come to an end for now. "Very well," he said to Captain Haru, up on the deck of the cargo ship. "I see no reason to hold you any further." He held out a hand, and a lieutenant deposited a set of stamped papers into it. Zhao looked them over to confirm that they were properly completed, and then gave them to Haru. "These will confirm the inspection. Proceed to Shujing, and avoid the waters around Crescent Island. The Navy is performing some maneuvers there, and any civilian ships that blunder into things risk being sunk or seized with no compensation." He didn't even look at Captain Haru's bow before stomping off to the plank that would take him back to his own ship. Sooner or later the Avatar would come. Zhao would just have to remain vigilant, and keep in mind the rewards he stood to gain. The first thing Aang did was go hunting for Mai. He had been worried out of his mind for her during the whole inspection, but Appa had also needed him to stay calm in a dark and cramped space, so he had been forced to wait to go on his frantic search. After Haru came down to open the smuggling compartment and confirm that the Fire Navy had gone, Aang had left Sokka to help get Appa back into view of the sky, and sped through the ship shouting for Mai, even using his airbending to enhance the echoes. Then, at last, Aang had called out, "Mai! It's safe." In the engine room, and a single hand pushed its way up through the pile of coal near the boiler. Aang had dragged out a filthy figure that was human in shape only, and the sole confirmation of Mai's identity was the gravelly voice that said, "I need a bath, and something to wash the puke out of my mouth." Immediately. And so it was that an hour later, Aang and Sokka met a freshly scrubbed Mai in her small cabin. She had wrapped herself in several layers of robes, but her hair was left free and hanging, a shadow dogging her movements. Momo immediately squirmed out of Sokka's arms and jumped over to perch on Mai's head, and her only response was to give a sigh that smelled faintly of cheap wine. Aang sat down on the plank that was serving as the bed, across from Mai. "How are you feeling?" She gave a snort. "The seawater I had to bathe in was freezing, the wine tasted rancid, I have a headache, I think there will be coal dust up my nose for the rest of my life, and I still don't want to acknowledge the existence of food." She lowered her eyes, and then added, "But Haru turned the engine back on now that we've passed inspection, and that's helped with my seasickness." "Thanks for asking." "No problem." Aang wished he had known how hard this whole voyage was going to be on her. He wasn't sure what else they could have done to get safely to Crescent Island, but surely they could have gotten some herbs or something to help her feel better. But then, that wasn't her only problem. "So you said the blue spirit attacked you again?" She nodded. "Right out in the hallway. I'm assuming that the Fire Nation inspectors didn't find and arrest anyone in an ugly opera mask." Sokka leaned against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest. "Nope. Once again, the mysterious blue spirit came and went without anyone but you seeing him." Mai nodded again. "You know it's Jet, right?" Aang blinked in surprise, and turned to Sokka, who simply shrugged. Aang turned back to Mai. "I don't like him much, either, but why do you think it's him?" "Well, there's how crazy he is about me being from the Fire Nation. That's a pretty big clue by itself. Why else would someone be harassing me like this? He's also a sword fighter, and the blue spirit uses a Deo blade. And then there was that whole thing with my encryption cog." "But I was with Jet in the engine room at the time," Sokka said. "I was with him when it rolled into view. So he found some way to arrange it." "Come on, I'm sure you could come up with a dozen ways to make that happen." "Well, 7 off the top of my head." Sokka stroked his chin. "Oh, now 8. Okay, maybe I can get to 12 if I had more time to think." Aang ran a hand over his bald head, and Momo jumped over to perch right on the arrow, his little paws warm on the bare scalp. "But what are we going to do about this? We don't have any proof, but this is a real danger to you. The blue spirit is trying to kill you, or get you in trouble so that someone else kills you." Mai pulled a small blade with a ring on the base from somewhere in her robes, and began spinning it around a finger. "Simple self-defense. We throw Jet overboard, or get Haru to lock him up or something. Oh, maybe Haru will tie rocks to his feet and then throw him overboard." Aang felt sick at the thought. "We can't just kill him. That will only cause more problems with the rest of the crew, and we don't even know for sure that it's Jet. I don't even want to hear about throwing people overboard. So then he'll kill me before we get to Crescent Island." Mai stared back at Aang, a solid, uncompromising stare that sent Momo leaping over to the top of Sokka's head. Sokka was so busy thinking that he didn't even seem to notice. "So we need proof of some kind before we can do anything more. That actually shouldn't be very hard. We're stuck on a boat with limited hiding places and a set of suspects who can't escape. It's just a matter of searching and producing a mask. Even if we can't tie it to Jet or whoever, the blue spirit isn't going to be able to attack again without his disguise. So he has to lay low, or reveal himself." His eyes focused on Aang. "And we have to do it before we get to Crescent Island tomorrow night." Aang frowned. "Why before then? I thought we're supposed to come back to the boat once we free your sister." Sokka turned to Aang and started to speak, but then realized that Momo was sitting on top of his head and shooed the lemur away before working to fix his ponytail. Momo perched on Aang's shoulder when Sokka finally got around to making his point. If we can't escape cleanly and you have to fly away from Crescent Island in a hurry, are you going to come back here, not knowing who's going to be ready and waiting? Or are you and Mai going to fly off by yourselves because it's too risky to come back to a boat with a blue spirit waiting on it? Aang blinked. Wait, what about you? And Katara? Hey, we don't know what will happen on Crescent Island. I'm just making the point that if we haven't solved anything by the time we take off for the waterbender prison, Mai's still going to be in danger once we're done there. Mai caught the blade she had been spinning in a reverse grip and stabbed it into the wall behind her without turning. When we're done. Yeah, I guess that will still be a problem. A ghost of her old smirk flickered across her face. But by then I'll be in a position to fight back, with allies and no seasickness. I don't think we have to worry about that contingency much, at least not right now. Aang thought that was a good point, but said, still, Sokka's right that it will be easier to get it done now. Let's start looking, and I think you should stay near one of us until we find the proof we need. Mai sighed. I hate throwing up for an audience. The Fire Nation's proximity to the Earth Kingdom was as much bane as it was boon. It was relatively easy to transport soldiers and supplies to the war front, just a matter of crossing what eventually became known as the Crucible Sea and landing at one of the colony ports. None of the Earth Kingdom's monarchs had ever maintained much of a navy before Sozin launched what he had called the Glorious War, but the seas did not remain uncontested for long. In the initial phase of what would eventually be called the 100 Years' War, the Fire Navy had been forced to deal with pirates turned privateers who attacked supply ships, but when it came to a fight between disciplined sailors on metal destroyers and thieves on old wooden junks, the result was largely academic. After almost a decade, the Earth Kingdom had finally built and crewed enough ships to make a real fight of it and earn the Crucible its name, and the various privateers were ready to earn their commissions in less crowded venues. And so the pirates had turned to the Fire Nation itself. They began raiding the ports of the outer islands, stealing all they could carry and burning everything else. Soon enough, the Earth Kingdom picked up on the tactic, although those crews were more interested in destruction and harassment than theft. Various task forces were created to deal with the threats, but hunting on water was not as easy as hunting on land. The only way to solve the problem had been to keep all enemies out of Fire Nation waters entirely, pushing the fighting back onto the open seas where armor, firepower, and provisions were all that mattered. Thus, the first blockade was enacted, a massive deployment of enough Fire Navy ships to keep the entire western boundary of the Crucible Sea within the sight of one vessel or another and within catapult range. By the time Zhao had joined the Navy, the blockade had become a simple fact of life, like weather and buoyancy. It was so successful that Admiral Iroh had stolen the idea outright to slowly draw a noose around the Northern Water Tribe. When the war came to a close with the return of Sozin's comet, there had been talk of finally dismantling the blockade. Zhao had no opinion one way or another, as blockade duty was no path to advancement and he was already in command of the primary navy base of the United South Pole Colonies, but it was the subject of quite a bit of debate within high command. It was eventually decided that the blockade could be reduced to a mere patrol circle, albeit one that was heavily sailed by a small navy of ships, to see if any threats might probe the more porous boundary. Then Zhao had discovered that the Avatar himself was heading for Crescent Island, at an unknown time from an unknown direction. Not only was the blockade restored with impressive speed, but now Zhao himself was a part of it. It made him almost regret ever twisting the truth out that Suki girl. Zhao was lounging in his cabin, pretending to be reading reports but really wishing for a drink. He had to admit that the restored blockade made tactical sense, as the Avatar would have to cross it to get to his destination, and any fighting on Crescent Island itself could destabilize what had always been a situation with potential for disaster. The facilities there were uniquely suited to manage waterbenders, but it was impossible to forget that an entire ocean waited just beyond the prison's walls. After what he had seen in the storms of the South Pole, Zhao had no doubt that the Avatar could very well create quite disaster, indeed. Still, it didn't mean he had to like the blockade, and the reduced odds of capturing the Avatar himself. Zhao was actively grumbling over that notion when there was a knock on his cabin door. "Come in." His aide led in Lieutenant Shi, one of the soldiers under his direct command who had been on duty earlier when that Earth scow had come across the blockade. "What is it, Lieutenant?" "As you can see, I'm very busy right now. She bowed with a stiffness that immediately caught Zhao's interest. Commander, sir. I felt it my duty to report an oversight I believe I have committed. Zhao was immediately on his feet. Tell me. Sir, I reported that there was nothing unusual found during my inspection. The only thing I came across seemed to be the result of a prank between members of the cargo ship's crew, a boot pinned to the floor with a blade. I was in the mess talking about it when I realized something. The blade was a Fire Nation weapon. Zhao stepped closer to the man, fists clenching at his sides. How do you know? Tell me details. Sir. It was a small blade, a holdout weapon, and the quality of the metal was easily military grade. It gleamed with a whiteness that only the finest steel has, and the flat of the blade was painted crimson. I've seen such weapons before, of course, but it only just occurred to me to question why it would be on a dirt vessel, and dash. Idiot. Zhao immediately ran out of his cabin, to where his aide was waiting. Have the ship sailing immediately. We're leaving the blockade and heading for Crescent Island. Tell the captain to burn the engines out if he has to, we need to get there now. The aide bowed and ran off to carry out the orders. That just left she. Zhao returned to his cabin to find the lieutenant standing at attention, trying desperately to keep his face under control. As well he should. Zhao walked right up to him and struck the man across the face. You're hereby demoted, get down to the engine room and start shoveling. She started to bow, but then stopped himself. Sir, I contest. On what grounds? None, sir. But I would not be a good son of fire if I did not ask for trial by combat. Zhao snorted. Very well. We'll have an Agni Kai after I capture the Avatar. Providing you don't get thrown overboard, first. Now get out of my cabin. So much for the blockade. It was almost anticlimactic when Sokka found the blue spirit mask so easily in Jet's cabin. No, actually, it was entirely anticlimactic. And far too easy. Aang and Mai were up on deck in the last minutes of daylight, the former playing with Momo and the latter cursing whoever invented oceans, both of them being conspicuously conspicuous for any murderous stalker warrior types. Sokka was charged with the first phase of the investigation, sneaking into everyone's cabins and rummaging around for carelessly hidden blue spirit evidence. But it wasn't actually supposed to work. Nevertheless, the blue spirit mask in was Sokka's hand, pulled right out of Jet's knapsack. It was made of heavy wood, and very nicely painted. Sokka bet that it would almost look alive in the right lighting. Without letting go of the mask, certainly not because of an irrational worry that it would disappear as soon he put it down and create even more confusion, he pinched himself and confirmed that he was indeed awake and capable of feeling pain. Okay, so this was all real. Nothing to do then but bring the mask up to the main deck and make dramatic accusations. Sokka stood up, turned around, and found Jet standing in the doorway. Sokka said, "Gah." Jet said, "You're a little high-strung." His gaze went to the mask in Sokka's hands, and he gave a small smile. Figured it out, huh? Sokka held the mask up in front of his chest like a shield, just in case. I know you're the blue spirit. You've been trying to kill Mai. Jet nodded. You must have lots of questions. Sit down, and we'll talk. Wait, what? Talk? You just want to trap me in here so that you can dash. Jet snorted. Strangle you to protect my identity? Thump your head against the wall until you've forgotten your own name? That would be pretty counterproductive, don't you think? He pushed past Sokka and sat down on the plank serving as the bed. Sokka remained standing. Okay, so that doesn't make any sense. But hating Mai just because she's Fire Nation doesn't make sense, either. Believe me, I hate the Fire Nation, too. Like, a burning, festering hate that makes my stomach hurt and keeps me awake at night sometimes. But Mai's on our side. Killing her is the opposite of being helpful. Oh, I wasn't trying to kill her because she was born in the Fire Nation. I'm doing it because she's probably still working for them. Jet blinked. But for the record, I wasn't trying to kill her all those times. Getting her caught would have been enough. Sokka lowered the mask. What do you mean, probably still working for them? You just admitted that they want to arrest her. I have a source. I do favors from time to time, and in exchange I get some good information about how the Fire Nation operates and how I can hurt it. Just before you and the Avatar arrived in my village, I learned all about the politics of the royal family. How Prince Jose has been gunning for years to replace his older brother as the crown heir. How his daughter, Princess Angela, is a liar and a manipulator, and probably the third cruelest person alive. Third? Well, she's younger than us, so she probably hasn't had the same opportunities as her father and grandfather. Jet smirked. I also learned about the princess had a childhood friend who taught herself how to throw knives better than anyone else in the world. Sokka shook his head. Jet just so happened to get this information from an unnamed source, and that was supposed to make it okay to kill someone who had actively saved Aang's life. So what? It's not news to me that Mai is a big deal back home. She even admitted that she was betrothed to one of those royals. She got sick of it all and defected. Yeah, I know the story. And if I'm wrong, then I'm sorry I tried to help the Avatar by killing Mai. Really? But I want you to answer something for me. I want your true, honest opinion. I want you to think about it as long as you need. I will accept whatever answer you give me, so long as you really believe it. Enough build up, already. I've had enough anticlimaxes for today. Jet nodded. All right. I want to know if Mai really acts like someone who hates the Fire Nation and wants to help bring it down. It was a good thing the blue spirit mask was thick and solid. Sokka didn't realize he was gripping it so tightly until pain started shooting through his fingers. Why are you asking me? Because I think you're a good guy. You're Water Tribe, so I know you've suffered under the Fire Nation. I know you're honest because you're too cranky to be anything else. No offense. And you're probably the only person who can protect the Avatar now that I don't have dash. Jet nodded at the mask, that. Sokka looked down at it, turned it around in his hands. It truly was an ugly mask, all dead eyes and snarls. Why the blue spirit? That's not my story to tell. But it includes the usual reasons why people hide their faces. Well, I don't have an answer for you. Not yet. And certainly not while Jet was withholding important information. Sokka was just sneaky enough to realize that someone Jet or Mai or both were far sneakier than him and he probably had no idea what was really going on. But he would be doing his best starting now to figure it out. That's fair. Just keep thinking about it, and don't let your guard down. Oh, and you should have this. Jet reached into one of the pouches on his belt and produced the golden encryption cog. He tossed it to Sokka in a slow underhand. It's not going to do me any good, and you might find a use for it. Sokka caught it in his right hand, leaving the mask in his left. They were the two sides of a war that was already over, the visage of a masked avenger, and a component in one of the most technologically sophisticated systems of the imperial oppressor. If there was anything he hated more than anticlimaxes, it was heavy-handed metaphors. All right, Sokka finally said. I'll be going. Thanks for not making a big deal out of this and trying to kill to protect your identity. Haru will probably down shortly to throw you overboard or something. Glad to help. Beneath a glowing moon, Aang watched as Haru threw the blue spirit mask over the side of the ship, and couldn't help but feel sorry for the earthbender. None of this was supposed to be part of helping with the Crescent Island mission, but somehow it had all become so complicated. Although wooden, the mask sank quickly into the inky waters of the night. Haru turned back to where Jet was standing, wrists tied together. The whole crew had been assembled on deck for this, everyone who had come from the hidden village where Jet had lived and worked. The burly brothers Chong and Wang stood on either side of Jet, on guard, while the girl Smellerbee, the woman Do-Eyes Hang, and all the rest watched in a cluster. Mai and Sokka were below decks, staying safe and away from all the tension. Haru sighed and said to Jet, I can't pass any formal judgment on you. My father is on the village council, not me, and it's the council's mission to help the Avatar that you endangered. They will have to decide what to do about you. He drew himself up to stand taller, and for once, Aang could see the maturity in the young man. But I'm captain of this ship, and responsible for getting everyone back alive. I can't risk you doing any more damage. You'll be imprisoned in the smuggling hold, hands tied for as long as the Avatar and his friends are aboard. Jet nodded. I understand. Sorry for the trouble. Haru shook his head. No, I don't think you are. He motioned, and Chong and Wang dragged Jet to the stairs leading into the ship. With that, the rest of the crew dispersed to get back to work. Aang could see that most were as closed-faced as Mai usually was, and fervently hoped that some kind of mutiny wasn't in the making. He had never sailed much before, and had always found pleasure and excitement in the stories about pirate adventurers, stories about daring raids on the greedy rich to liberate antiques for the open market. There had been mutinies in those stories, of course, but Aang had never before realized how scary they were. For an airbender, leaving ahead of trouble was usually a simple matter of hopping on a sky bison and saying, "Yip, yip," but now that he was trapped on a ship in the middle of an ocean with a bunch of people he couldn't really trust, he found that a mutiny could be just as much of a disaster as a summer storm. Aang walked over to Haru and said, "Thank you for dealing with that." "No, Avatar, I'm sorry it was necessary." Haru ran a hand through his long hair. "Jet and Smellerbee have been part of our village for less than a year, but they've been so helpful, we thought we could trust them with something like this. Our judgment was wrong, and that's endangered you and your friends. We've never really had to deal with criminals in our village before, but I'm sure my dad will figure out a way to make it work. He's a great leader." Haru drew in a deep breath, and let it out in a burst. "For now, I have to get you where you need to go." He began striding towards the tub's control wheel. Aang trotted after him. "Are we still on track?" "Yes. It will be slow going, because we have to turn the engine off in the morning and rely on the sails. We'll just be creeping along towards Crescent Island, and once the sun goes down, we'll dim all our lights and pull up as close as we can get." Haru stepped up to the wheel, untied the ropes that had been holding it steady, and took it firmly in his hands. Aang looked out over the bow of the ship, at the black ocean that stretched to meet the stars. Somewhere ahead was the island prison where Sokka's sister was hopefully still living. Worries on top of worries. Mai spent the last leg of the journey leaning over the aft railing, once again miserable with full seasickness. The engine had been her only cure, the awful bobbing sensation, and so staying in her cabin would just lock her in a closed space with whatever unfortunate smelling things came up out of her stomach. She tried to tell herself that it wouldn't be long now, just one more day, and then her mission would finally be over. It didn't really make her feel better. Even aside from the nausea, questions plagued her mind. Had Zuko and Azula even received her transmission, or had Zhao interfered somehow? Had she given them enough time to get to Crescent Island? What would happen when Aang got there? An island was a fairly big place, so how could Zuko know precisely how to ambush his prize? And, most importantly, if everything went according to Azula's plan and Zuko got his ticket back to the homeland, what would happen after that? It was starting to bother Mai. Everyone knew the condition Fire Lord Azula had put on Zuko's return, and the Avatar was an enemy of the Fire Nation for obvious reasons, but what would the old man who banished his grandson for cowardice do to a 12-year-old airbender? It made sense to lock him up in relative comfort, so that he wouldn't be reborn as a waterbender. But Mai knew a lot about the fate of the water tribes, now. The southern water tribe was broken up, and the portion still under Fire Nation control was probably buried under snow by now. Prince Iroha's control of the northern tribe was as absolute as it was mysterious. If the Avatar was reborn to one of the tribes, he or she would either not be a threat at all, or actually under the Fire Nation's direct control. They could identify the Avatar young and raise him or her as a loyal servant. Of course, Aang would be an obstacle to that whole plan. But Zuko was a good person. Mai knew that. She had watched him as they both grew up, and had seen firsthand his sense of honor, his rare kindness. Zuko deserved to go home, deserved to have his branch of the family usurp Azulan's favor. Mai had let herself be scarred for that cause. Her stomach roiled, and she groaned as she leaned over the rail to be sick. One more day to go. The moment Aang saw the sun dip below the rippling horizon, the tricky part began. As the day had ended, Crescent Island had at last appeared in the distance. It was easy enough to spot, what with it being an active volcano, the lava that ran down the sides glowed vividly in the waning daylight, illuminating even the airspace above the island, and a constant stream of black smoke rose into the sky. The Fire Navy ships patrolling the surrounding waters were similarly given away by the spotlights on their bows and the spouts of steam that followed their slow travel around the island, so it was easy enough to stop the tub well short any danger. The danger was saved for when night fell. The whole crew minus Jet had assembled on the main deck and taken spotter positions all along the rails. Maya was still at the aft, nominally a spotter but mostly just being sick. Aang stood alone at the center of the ship, just behind the first mast. The second mast's sails had been taken down, so that there was just one lone sail to catch the wind. The ship would move slower that way, but it was exactly as they wanted. The last part of the journey would be about precision, not speed. At Haru's nod, Aang spread out his arms wide, and then gently swung them together as though trying to catch a falling sparrow-keyed chick. The air responded, moving steadily but softly into the sail to fill it, and the tub moved along at the wind's pace. As Aang kept the wind streaming steadily, Haru worked the wheel. The first spotter to speak was Du-Eye's Hang, who noted a Fire Navy ship far off the starboard bow. Haru steered to go around it and Aang lessened the wind, allowing the tub to pivot rather drastically and follow a shallow curve that bypassed the enemy hunter and its arcing spotlight completely. Sokka spoke up a little while later, pointing out another patrol, and once again a fine adjustment of wind and steering were enough to sneak past it. It continued on like that, a meandering journey through the sea, and except for those moments, the crew was silent, so that it seemed to Aang that the creaking of the ship and the lapping of the water against the hull were like shouts in his ear. Still, with just those sounds, and no lanterns to give them away in the night, the tub was able to put down anchor within sight of Crescent Island's sheer shores. Haru and the crew worked together to open the wide doors in the deck to reveal Appa waiting in the cargo bay, and then it was time to leave. Aang hopped down to land right on Appa's head, and gave his Sky Bison buddy a happy pat before looking back up to Haru. "Thanks for everything. I know how big a deal this has been for you, and we're all really grateful." Sokka helped Mai up into Appa's saddle, and then gave a wave. "Yeah, seriously, I'll owe you and your village a huge one for this." Haru just shook his head. "Any help we can provide the Avatar is a gift we're happy to be able to give. No one owes anything to anyone." But Sokka snorted. "You can say that, but it doesn't change the honor of the Southern Water Tribe. Trust me, you've earned yourself some extra family that's very fond of wearing blue, and family helps family." Aang looked back with some approval at Sokka. The older boy could be grumpy, cynical, and a bit too concerned with everything making sense, but he really was a good person. Then Aang noticed Mai crouching at Sokka's feet, looking even greener than usual, and realized that they were wasting time. "Appa, yip, yip." Appa let out a sigh of happiness with the same volume of a steam engine, and gave a flap of his tail that floated him straight up out of the cargo bay. Aang tugged the reins as soon as Appa's feet were above the ship's rails, and directed the Sky Bison forward and down again. Appa obediently glided out over the ocean and sank back down, settling to float on the surface of the water, bobbing with the waves. Aang heard Mai gagging, but focused on the reins, steering Appa to swim for Crescent Island. This close, there was less worry about the patrol ship, but they were still careful to not leave a wake in the water. It was hard to tell how long it took, going so slowly in the dark, but the night was not yet old when Appa pulled out of the water to step onto the beach. Crescent Island was like a solitary mountain that had been uprooted out of its range and had its edges folded to keep it standing upright. The only beach, the one where Aang and his friends were now disembarking, was a flat rocky shelter amidst the rising cliffs just to the left of the bleeding volcano, where small bare trees and sickly stringy grasses clung to life. In the glow of the lava, Aang could see that the Fire Nation had built some structures right onto the side of the main mountain walkways held up by arches that withstood the heat of the lava even as the glowing liquid rock flowed underneath them, connecting several towering buildings that perched on cliffs as though trying to catch a cool breeze. There were people moving on those walkways, and the armor of Fire Nation soldiers glowed dully in the light cast by the flowing lava. One of the towers, Aang noticed, was more ornate than the rest. The others were military in their plainness, but this one had the sloping roofs and pointed architecture of a civilian Fire Nation structure, and in the lava's light, Aang could make out decorative motifs blackened but unharmed that were the exclusive province of a fire temple. The other towers had lights shining within, but the temple alone was completely dark. Aang turned to his friends. Appa was shaking seawater out of his fur, while Momo dodged the spray. Maya was patting her robes in what Aang knew to be a check of her hidden weapons, and Sokka was adjusting the straps of a backpack he had just put on. Aang got Sokka and Maya's attention with a wave, and pointed to the temple. I think I found us a good starting point. In the dark of the smuggling bay, Jet had only his sense of hearing to tell him about what was going on around him. He heard Haru and the Avatar's goodbye, as well as the sounds of the Sky Bison taking off. He heard the cargo bay doors close again, and the footsteps of the rest of the crew as they got into their new positions to watch for danger as they waited for the Avatar's return. He heard one particular set of boots walk into the main cargo bay, and so he was ready with a smile that was equally grateful and confident when the hidden door opened to let the light of a lantern into the smuggling compartment. Smellerby the lantern on the floor as she drew a knife and leaned in to cut Jet's bonds. The others think I'm getting the engine ready for a quick getaway if we need it. I can stay out of sight for as long as I need to. Jet nodded, and climbed out of the smuggling bay. He did a few stretches, and blinked his eyes rapidly to get them used to the lantern light after spending a day in complete darkness. Before you suit up, go back up and ask Chong and Wang to help you with something. They're the best fighters in the crew besides us, and once we take them out of the fight, it's just a bunch of earthbenders in the middle of the ocean against 2 blue spirit warriors. Smellerby nodded, and picked up a bundle from the floor to toss to Jet. As expected, it was a black tunic, a broadsword, and a blue spirit mask, the uniform of their cause. Smellerby had a similar bundle beside her. While Jet unfolded the tunic, she said, "Couldn't we try to get everyone else on our side? It'd be a shame if we wound up having to kill someone from the village for this mission." Jet held up the mask. "And how would we explain this? Our order has too many secrets. It's a shame, but that's why we were selected. We can do the hard jobs, the ones that the Fire Nation has made necessary. And right now, our mission is to get a supporter of the Oze faction away from the Avatar, by whatever means necessary." Smellerby sighed, and gave a nod. "All right. I'll go get Chong and Wang. Meet us in the engine room." She left, and Jet began changing into his uniform. There was little point to the disguise, now, but disguise wasn't the only reason to wear a mask. It joined Jet to the rest of the order, and proclaimed that he was acting for more than his own sake. The mask said that even if he failed tonight, the blue spirit would never die. Check the description for the links to the author.